You don't know how sweet I am. You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet. You don't know how sweet I am.
Yo, check this. I might not be what you want me to be, so you might not see what you want to see. But if you got a minute, listen to what I gotta say, cause it's a brand new year and it's a brand new day. See, there's a gap between my culture and the life that I lead, so some will call me an apple, and some a bad seed. They have no idea how my heart will bleed. Their words and attitudes are things I just don't need.
You don't know how sweet I am. I am what I am, and I am sweet.
You see, I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of where I'm from. Those ones spreading racism, they're just fucking dumb. Now, if you're looking at my life and you say I've assimilated, to simplify things, just a little more complicated. See, I'm a modern day native with a modern day life. I have modern day problems and modern day strife. Now I hear other natives, they talk about the past, and will I do the same? Fuck that. See, I've got no time to dwell on what's already done. I've got too many things that I want to do. And they don't include knives, and they don't include guns. I'm talking about knowledge and sharing it too. See, my people need to learn how to cohabitate, get rid of the anger, and get rid of the hate. We gotta stop for a minute and learn to educate. And you'll see in the end, we all have to communicate. I know there'll be a time to make a stand and a time to fight, but if you do that, make sure the cause is right. Because if the cause is right, and the cause is just, greater numbers of people will be backing you up. History has repeatedly shown to us all that united we stand and divided we fall. They were talking about natives and natives alone, because this is a big world, and this world is our home. Now I've seen some beautiful people, and ugly ones too, and there's no single color that comes into view. So the message I'm sending, it's not all that long. It's just, I want the human race to be stronger than strong. I said I just want the human race to be stronger than strong.
You all have to be strong.
Done it. Word.
We all have to be strong. Peace.
Okay. Sigoli swagwag. Galahini nio gets wagi sliwagi niwa kitaloda onidaag ngwe winege ani bojo danse okinapi how yanko yuko Thomas. Um, for anyone who is new, I just introduced myself. I said Sigoli swagwag or hello everyone. Galahindi nio gets. So Galahindi is my name and it means clouds passing over in the colonial language. And I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations. I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Delaware, and Huron nations in an area that we call the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Treaty Territory. And in the colonial context, that means I'm in southwestern Ontario. So I'm in the northern part of Turtle Island that's been segregated and relabeled Canada. And I say Yonko, Yukotola, or thank you, friends, for being here and joining. So, uh, it's 10 to 7 in the morning, and I've been up since about 4 o'clock and going over uh, some of the latest news and events that are happening here in Canada. I shared a panel discussion yesterday, and during that panel discussion, which was taking place at the Western University, there were some protests, and there were essentially two groups of people who were protesting. There were people who were protesting for the recognition and acknowledgement of those who call themselves Metis. And then there were the counter protesters who are fighting something that we call Bill C-53, which is a bill that will acknowledge the existence of this Metis groups and um, assign them treaty rights that allow them to claim much of the same treaties rights as First Nations and other Métis people here on Turtle Island. And so, what we're going to share today is a couple of different things. I want to first of all kind of give a little bit of this first clip that I'm going to share is going to be from a perspective of someone who acknowledges that they are Métis and how they recognize that and what it means to them. And then I'm going to share another clip of a that was done, a short documentary about some research into people who have been recognized for a while as Métis people and who were reached out to discuss their Métis ancestry, and to the surprise of the journalists, were declined interviews. For me, on a personal level, if if so, one of the things First Nations people do when we meet each other is we always ask, "Who's your family? Where are you from? Who are your parents? Who are your grandparents?" Because all of that feeds into who you are. And when you are proud of your ancestry and proud of who you are and who you belong to, what community you belong to, you don't even hesitate to answer. My parents are, I am from, this is my clan. It just naturally rolls off the tongue. It's just it's your identity. It's who you are. And why why leave that in a cloud of mystery if you are who you say you are? So, anytime someone hesitates about saying who their family is or where they're from, for me, just off the bat, raises red flags. Um, but I mean, that's me. So I'm going to share some content today that is going to give a little bit of a an argument for both sides as to who is Métis, how what does Métis even mean? Because some people think that as long as you have uh, a First Nations ancestor somewhere in your background, that makes you Métis, and that can be argued against because if somebody's got an indigenous mother, say a Cree mother, Haudenosaunee mother, uh, Chippewa or Ojibwe mother, they're not Métis. They're indigenous. They're First Nations. So where does that distinction come from, and how do we follow that? So that's kind of what I'm trying to get into today, because even as First Nations people, I think that there is still even a debate amongst ourselves as to who we acknowledge and who we recognize, and um, and I'm kind of torn as far as who do we support. Hey, Bagel Rabbit! Oh, oh my goodness, Sagoli, welcome in. So Sagoli Swagwag, Galahindi Nilgats, Wagi Sliwagi, Niwa Kitolona, Onida Unege, Ani, Bojo, Danse, Okinapi, How, Yanko Yukotongas. Um, and welcome in. Thank you so much for the raid, Bago. So for and welcome in Raiders. I hope your stream went well. I was lurking a little bit earlier in your stream actually. Nice to see you. For those of you who are new, welcome in Raiders. I just introduced myself. If you don't know who I am, I said Sagoli Swagwag, or hello everyone. Galahindi Neil gets. So my name is Galahindi, and in the colonial language, it means clouds passing over, and I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations. I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Delaware, and Huron nations in an area that we call the Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory, which in the colonial context means southwestern Ontario. And we're in the northern part of Turtle Island. It's been the part that's been kind of relabeled, segregated, and relabeled Canada. I'm actually just getting started. We're just talking about one of the conflicts. Again, I guess for those of you who've not been here before, I should let you know. What I do sometimes, I do two types of streams. I do education and awareness streams, and I do music streams. My education and awareness streams is about trying to bring some awareness and information about the indigenous peoples or the original peoples of Turtle Island, or what some call North and Central America. And so today we're talking about what is called a group of people who are called the Métis. And the Métis people are kind of it's a French word for mixed. And so people oftentimes confuse Métis people with First Nations people and vice versa. And we're just actually talking about that context. And I appreciate the lurk, Bagel Bunny, and thank you again so much for bringing your community over. And I appreciate everyone coming over. By the way, if you're interested in First Nations, Indigenous history, ceremony, and culture, please hit the follow button. I know that I'm about 30 people away from 3K, and I know when I hit my 3K, I'm going to do a 24-hour, my first ever 24-hour stream. I'm going to set that up. So I appreciate all the new follows. Thank you so much for that. And so there's a debate here in Canada. There is a about who the Métis people are. How do you know who they are, and um, do they have the rights to the same benefits and treaties as the First Nations and Inuit people? And kind of that's where we're at today, is trying to determine um, our own perspectives. So I'm going to share some videos about different perspectives on both sides, so that you can kind of see the pros and the cons, and people who have attitudes about either and or. And you guys can make your own judgment as to what you think, as far as and I know that some of the new people here might not really grasp what it really means to see that change or that recognition, because uh, of the ongoing colonial teachings that have been going on. And so here's the other thing: is that upcoming September 30th is what we call National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, which is really a day to acknowledge and recognize the history of residential schools in what the so-called Canada. In the U.S., you called them boarding schools, but they were genocidal systems, institutions, if you will, where the goal was to assimilate indigenous people into a non-indigenous society and to essentially eradicate our recognition and rights and to the resources on the lands that we existed on prior to colonization. And so the next week, you'll see, if you want to check my schedule, a number of different events, films, panel discussions, and documentaries that are going to address various aspects of the of that history. So certainly, I appreciate the new follows, and I hope that you will look into some of the information that comes up and some of the events that come up. The other thing as well, for anyone who's new here, is part of the issues with residential schools and boarding schools in the U.S. is that it left a lot of intergenerational trauma amongst the indigenous peoples. So what we're doing is we're raising funds for something called the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. It's an organization in British Columbia that conducts sharing circles, healing ceremonies, and helps with programming for the survivors of residential schools and their families, as well as those who did not survive. Because the families of those who did not survive also have some intergenerational conflict to deal with as well. So, anybody who has the means and are able to donate anything, it's certainly appreciated. And Ruskinator, Yelko, for that donation, I appreciate that so much. And everything helps, believe me. Whether it's $1 or $100, whatever you have the means to contribute, certainly is appreciated. And thank you so much. I actually, when I first started this, I thought, well, my stream's not that big. I don't have, huge numbers of people. So I set my goal to like $200, and we met that like the first stream of September. So then I increased it to 400, and then we went beyond that, and then so I appreciate all of the generosity and the support that the community is showing, and thank you again so much. For your contribution, Ruskinator. I truly appreciate that again. So, without further ado, I will stop babbling on here, and we'll get started with our first clip here. Again, there are people who recognize their heritage and their ancestry, and there are legitimate Métis people in so-called Canada. So don't get me wrong. I'm not leaning this one way or the other because, again, like I said, I'm a bit torn myself as to how we recognize the Métis people because it's a definition that was set out by a colonial system so that eh, some might argue that it's meant to be divisive and ultimately it has been. And so you will see that as we go through some of the content that we shared today. And blueberries again, Yelko, for your donation as well. Thank you so much for your generosity. And so let me get my mug up to screen here, and we'll get this started. And I hope that you take something away from this, whether you lean towards yes, this Métis group should be acknowledged, or no, it shouldn't. Either way, it's kind of out there for you. This is just for you to kind of review, decipher, and kind of analyze on in your own mind as to how you feel that this should go. And so let's go with the first one. This is a short one. This one's only 7 minutes long, and this is called "Who Are the Métis?"
To me, Métis is here. It's in your heart. You know who you are. You are raised in your culture. You knew your history. But most of all, you didn't have to be told. You knew it. You lived it.
Well, certainly us as Métis people know who we are and have always known who we are. But you know, Métis is one of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, clearly in the Constitution of Canada under Section 35.
Métis people, sometimes when you think of Indigenous peoples of Canada, there's, you know, like First Nations, there's Inuit, and people think Métis, but at the same time, like, we're not just kind of grouped in with First Nations, like we're our own people, we have our own voice.
Je vois le peuple métis comme une personne autonome qui a l'autonomie et qui a une culture et une langue mixte.
I think that if educators could relay that story to their Métis students, that you're part of a family and a community that is distinct, they have their own culture and they have their own language, then the kids can go with a positive message and want to connect and understand.
We have a word that's Otepemsawak, and that's we own ourselves. We are free people. We look after ourselves. And they have truly stood behind that from all history that we can look back on.
Because of that, that's why we as a Métis people are resilient. We're entrepreneurs. We're also people that can adapt.
I believe that Métis people have shown that they have built an economy. They have shown that they take ownership of their language, and they continue to show that throughout the decades.
To be Métis in 2020 is to kind of take ownership over your own identity. I don't necessarily think there's like a one-stop answer for it. Like even what it is to be Métis for myself might be different for another person.
It's really important for educators to know not all the kids look Métis. There's no one way of looking Métis. You could learn one thing and the other family does it differently, and you have to respect that and like let them teach you, or let yourself learn from community around them.
So I think that it's very important to establish ourselves as a distinct people with a distinct language and a distinct way of being.
The language is the essence of our culture. And for me, being a Métis man, that's how I identify that I'm distinct. If you know the language or have an understanding about language, that is the essence of the culture.
When we celebrate Métis culture in the classroom, it makes space for everyone to feel valued, and for all the students to want to celebrate who they are and who their families are. Then it makes space for everyone to celebrate who they are. The Métis Nation knows themselves through family and through having that relational connection, and so that relational understanding of self is even in the small things.
I had a happy childhood. I remember we lived right off the land. That happiness was because our family unit was strong. And then when my mother passed away at TB, my whole world changed. And they flew us to Fort Resolution. And here, they took us to a big building. Walk in those doors. Little did I know, the sense of losing all our family, our home, our community, they had nobody, we were alone. I tried to put it behind and try to move forward, and my children, I would say my life and my children is what I concentrate on, my Métis heritage and my community, my people that I love.
So I believe true reconciliation will come when people understand who we are and why we want everyone to work with us and contribute together.
All Canadian families have this historical relationship with Métis community that needs to be honored so that we can build a better future together that's more honoring towards each other.
There's so much to learn, and there's so much more than what's just taught in schools, and it's almost like once it's a thread that kind of gets pulled, you can kind of keep on pulling it.
I think actually coming to learn different aspects of who I was at a more mature state in my life, I think it was really beneficial for me because I was able to do some deep reflection, and I think that no matter the age, I think it's super lovely and great to know where you come from and who you are.
I know who I am. And to me, it's so important. That's my lifeline. It took me many, many years to actually come out and be visible and be able to speak out.
Now we get to be a part of bringing that Métis story in the classroom and letting them experience and celebrate their identity.
And I think that's what it takes, is our people who are in those key positions today and in schools, really teaching our kids the proper history of this country. I think it's going to make an amazing change to how the Métis will feel no longer forgotten, no longer ignored.
Salut, Jacques T. Watso, conseiller au Conseil des Abénaquis d'Odanak. Nous sommes le 15 septembre. Je viens de recevoir ma mise en demeure de Sylvain Rivard, alias Binvard.
But no mere letter is going to stop Jacques T. Watso from speaking out. He has made it his personal mission to denounce people whom he sees as falsely claiming to be indigenous. He calls it identity theft.
Il mentit à ma nation constamment. Il s'est servi de ma culture pour faire avancer sa carrière. Il se dit un grand allié, mais c'est comme un prédateur culturel des Premières Nations.
Here's the man whom Watso is threatening to take to court, Sylvain Rivard. He's an expert on indigenous clothing, well known in the media, the museum world, and the cultural community.
Et des couteaux de cou. Les couteaux de cou, ce sont les couteaux qui sont portés là.
C'est une tradition de le porter au cou plutôt qu'à la taille?
À la taille, c'est Hollywood.
For Jacques Watso, Sylvain Rivard is an imposter. One of far too many, he says. More and more people in Canada are self-identifying as Métis and demanding their rights. But who is and who isn't Métis? A question to which there are many answers.
On l'a cru, puis toute la majorité de la communauté l'a cru. Mais quand on a commencé à poser des questions, il était évasif sur le sujet.
Sylvain Rivard is a multidisciplinary artist, author, and recognized storyteller. Here he is at a festival in Germany. He also does presentations in schools. His stories have been published by an Indigenous publishing company. In 2019, at Montreal's annual book fair, he was part of a panel with Indigenous authors such as Joséphine Bacon, the great Innu poet and filmmaker.
Moi, ma base de culture part avec mes grands-parents. Ça a comme sauté une génération. Parce que je voyais que mes amis faisaient pas ça. Je me demandais comment ça se fait qu'on fait ça, nous. Oui. Et c'est là que j'ai toute eu l'histoire. J'ai fait OK.
Sylvain Rivard has been working with the Abenaki Nation for many years. He has even learned the Abenaki language. At the Abenaki Museum in Odanak, he made a major contribution to the exhibition Indians Beyond Hollywood, but his indigenous ancestry is not really clear. For years, Rivard presented himself as having an Abenaki background, but now he has stopped doing so. He says he has indigenous ancestors, but he still can't say who they were.
M. Rivard est devenu plus grand que son mensonge, puis l'ego artistique, culturel de son appropriation identitaire et culturelle de ma nation a fait en sorte que c'est devenu un personnage qui est représentatif de l'appropriation culturelle chez moi.
Sylvain Rivard refused to give us an interview on camera. When reached by phone, he said that he has not lied because his grandmother had always told him that he had Indigenous origins. He said that he has felt Indigenous ever since he was a boy and considers himself a cultural ambassador for the First Nations.
Et le grand argumentaire, c'est que je fais ça pour honorer les Premières Nations, chose qui n'est pas le cas parce que ce sont des prédateurs culturels qui viennent dans nos communautés, qui exploitent notre richesse culturelle, qui doit être diffusée que par nous, les Premières Nations.
But some other members of First Nations have spoken up in Rivar's defense. In a press release, they stated that even if he does not have Indigenous status, he has an Indigenous spirit, heart, and soul. They even called for Sylvain Rivard to be made an honorary member of the Abenaki Nation. Dolores Contré-Miguans is an artist, a teacher, and an expert on Indigenous customs. Her mission is to bring different cultures closer together. In this 2015 interview, she talks about her origins with the host of a web TV program.
À la maison, on parlait l'anglais, du baragouin Métis. C'est une langue autochtone entrecoupée avec du français, un peu d'anglais.
Okay.
Donc ça, c'était la langue maternelle.
She is the author of a book about teaching Native American spirituality. She has received funding for her professional activities from agencies and institutions not only in Quebec and Manitoba, but also in France.
C'est mon grand-père qui avait quitté l'Ontario, lui étant d'origine Anishinaabe avec son épouse aussi.
Moi, j'ai pas vu d'ascendance algonquine de son côté. Ça, ce sont ses ancêtres sur les 5 dernières générations.
Dominique Richaud, an expert in genealogy, could not find any Anishinaabe or Algonquin ancestors in Dolores Contré's family tree. Miguans is the last name of an Indigenous man who was her partner a number of years ago. They had a child, but never married.
Au moment de son entrevue d'embauche, Madame Contré a effectivement mentionné qu'elle était métisse.
Dolores Contré has been teaching courses on Indigenous traditions, customs, and beliefs at the Université de Montréal since 2008. Being Indigenous or Métis is not a requirement for the job, but the university is still going to look into her case.
Si on doit rectifier le tir, par exemple, sur notre site Internet où effectivement elle s'affiche comme métisse, on le fera, mais on doit poursuivre les différentes vérifications là, en ce sens-là.
Dolores Contré never responded to our request for an interview. In an email, her son told us that his mother hadn't done anything wrong. He said that she simply wanted to honor her father by transmitting his Algonquin culture.
Je suis Luma, femme médecine de la Première Nation Antaya, Abenaki Algonquin du Québec. J'en profite pour saluer tous les membres de mon clan.
Shaman Luma Wakan says she carries the medicine of the bright spirit inspired by Indigenous ancestral practices.
L'univers s'exprime pas ni en français ni en anglais ou d'autres langues. Elle s'exprime en vibration et en fréquence.
Luma Wakan, whose real name is Diane Tremblay, says that she is descended from an Iroquois chief and that her grandfather is Indigenous.
Si je vais dans sa généalogie à elle,
but our genealogist could not find any Indigenous ancestors in her family tree.
C'est du n'importe quoi, c'est du fast-food culturel, c'est dégueulasse. Puis même ceux qui font de l'appropriation culturelle, mais ils le font bien, ça ne justifie pas leurs mensonges.
Diane Tremblay refused to give us an interview on camera. On the phone, she told us that the public records are wrong. She said that all she wants to do is help people in need. Some other public personalities have made headlines recently.
In the circle of life, Indigenous people see life in a circular manner.
Nadine Saint-Louis, the director of a gallery of Indigenous art, has identified herself as Mi'kmaq and Algonquin Métis. But the Quebec newspaper La Presse revealed that her closest Indigenous ancestor was born in 1680. In response, she filed a lawsuit against La Presse. Her lawyer told us that the information spread by the media is false and defamatory. Michelle Latimer is a well-known Canadian film director. A CBC investigation raised questions about her claims to family ties with the Kitigan-Zibi First Nation near Maniwaki, Quebec. Ms. Latimer apologized for having said that she came from this community without having done all of the necessary checking first, but she still claimed to be Métis. The NFB subsequently withdrew her documentary Inconvenient Indian from its catalog. Marie-Josée Parent was considered the first Indigenous person to hold an elective office of the City of Montreal. She was put in charge of reconciliation with First Nations until a news item by Radio-Canada raised questions about her Indigenous background and forced her to step down from that portfolio.
Les réseaux sociaux ont réagi beaucoup il y a une dizaine de jours, grâce ou à cause d'Éric Pouliot-Tisdale, puisque c'est vous, Éric, qui avez sorti ces affirmations-là sur Internet, donc que Marie-Josée Parent ne serait pas Micmac.
Éric Pouliot-Tisdale is Mohawk, a big genealogy buff. On his website, he calls out public personalities who he says are usurping Indigenous identity.
C'est vraiment un fantasme, et puis si on les croit pas, on n'est pas correct.
His method: publishing people's family trees. Every time he does so, there are strong reactions on social media.
Et ils se prétendent d'ancêtres Micmac, d'ancêtres algonquins et tout ça, puis finalement on fait leur généalogie, puis on remonte à 1600, 1640.
Mon expérience de l'année dernière a été vraiment traumatisante, hein? Ça a été extrêmement blessant.
A year later, Marie-Josée Parent agreed to discuss these events with us. As so often with people who identify as Métis, she says that her feelings of belonging to the Mi'kmaq Nation first came to her from family oral traditions.
Une culture qui m'a été transmise et que je vis encore aujourd'hui, qui m'a été racontée, qui m'a été inculquée par mes parents.
In search of proof, she consulted some experts.
Pour reconstruire de façon factuelle, donc avec des preuves, l'histoire familiale qui m'a été racontée. Et systématiquement, cette histoire-là est maintenant corroborée par des faits historiques avec des certificats de naissance, des certificats de mariage, une généalogie complète.
Such as her great-grandmother's baptism certificate.
Un élément que je n'avais pas. Et donc, c'est quand même super intéressant de voir qu'elle a été baptisée sur la réserve de Lennox Island.
But our genealogist assures us that this certificate does not prove that her great-grandmother was Indigenous. Moreover, in the various government censuses, her great-grandmother never identified herself as Indigenous. That doesn't surprise Marie-Josée Parent, who says that for a long time, many Indigenous people hid their identity.
En fait, je vais vous avouer que en ayant appris tout ce que j'ai appris sur le caractère historique qui n'est pas toujours raconté ou qui est moins bien connu sur la réalité du territoire d'où je viens, j'ai envie de le célébrer davantage.
Across Canada, the number of people identifying as Métis has exploded. According to the 2016 census, there were 580,000 of them, an increase of 334% in 25 years. In Quebec, 69,000 people now say they are Métis, a 150% increase in 10 years.
On en revenait toujours à la même historique. 5 à 6 ancêtres que généralement environ 60 à 80% des Québécois ont, entre 1600 et 1670 approximativement, donc excessivement loin.
Even the Premier of Quebec says he has one of these ancestors.
Moi, j'ai une de mes arrière-grand-mères, arrière-arrière-arrière-grand-mère, qui s'appelle Marie Mitewi Migou Kou, donc qui était algonquine.
The Premier doesn't say that makes him Métis, but some members of First Nations to whom we spoke said that they found his statement offensive. Everywhere they turn, they come across more and more Quebecers with this new sense of legitimacy. To them, this massive Indigenous coming out, even if it's well-intended, has become exhausting and intolerable.
Il y a vraiment beaucoup de gens, et dans le milieu artistique, et dans le milieu médiatique, dans le milieu universitaire, ainsi de suite, c'est très, très, très varié, qui se prétendent de source autochtone, d'origine autochtone.
C'est condescendant, puis c'est arrogant de leur part. Puis c'est une autre forme de colonialisme de la part des Canadiens français sur les membres des Premières Nations. C'est blessant, là.
On a décidé de vous donner une paire de mocassins parce que c'est symbolique. L'idée, c'est de vous dire, de vous demander de chausser nos mocassins avec notre regard sur la vie.
Dominique Côté is the chief of an association of Métis people in the Beauce region of Quebec, the Sartigan Nation.
Moi, à l'école, on m'appelait la grosse quoi. C'était vraiment le quotidien de ce que je vivais dans ma vie, même à 10, 12, 13, 14 ans. Là.
She first founded the Antaya community in 2007, but then that group broke apart. Today, 150 of its members have followed Chief Côté to form the Sartigan Nation. She says that it was her grandmother who revealed her indigenous background to her, a community that history forgot, and a village that disappeared where the Quebec municipality of Saint-Victor-de-Beauce now stands.
Elle me disait, révèle la vérité sur notre groupe. Et comment je peux révéler la vérité sur notre groupe? Ben, en faisant un rapport historique, c'est ce qu'on a fait à la Nation, en démontrant ça. Et deux, c'est en obtenant notre reconnaissance avec Ottawa.
In Quebec, there are 11 Indigenous peoples that are recognized by the federal government. Every member of these groups has at least one Indigenous ancestor, less than 3 generations back. Métis organizations like Dominique Côté's are not recognized and do not have Indigenous rights, but many are still fighting to obtain them.
Et cette reconnaissance-là, je l'espère, va permettre, entre autres, qu'on puisse avoir une bonne collaboration, tant avec les communautés abénaquis du Odanak que Woolinac, puisqu'on est cousins, hein, on a certains des mêmes ancêtres.
But the Abenaki do not recognize her group as cousins.
Dominique Côté, elle a approché le conseil dans sa première organisation Antaya en 2006. Le dossier, c'était un petit document boudiné avec comme petite école. Là. C'était pas exceptionnel comme document de preuve historique. Là, mais...
In December 2019, Jacques Wetzel issued this press release on behalf of his nation. It states that Chief Côté and her group are identity thieves.
Je lui ai dit que je comprends son inquiétude et que je comprends qu'avec tous les groupes qui existent, c'est difficile de s'y retrouver.
Hard to know, indeed. There are Métis associations like the Sartigan Nation in practically every part of Quebec. Is it possible that there are actually that many Métis communities that history forgot? On this point, researchers' opinions differ.
Selon les données archivistiques et historiques que j'ai consultées, pour moi, en tant que spécialiste et expert sur la question, il n'y a aucun doute qu'il y a eu des Métis au Québec.
Sébastien Mallette identifies as Métis. A professor at Carleton University, he studies Métis groups that are trying to get themselves recognized. He thinks that these groups must be considered on a case-by-case basis. With 2 other researchers, he has published a book called Les Bois Brûlés de l'Outaouais, which discusses the origins of the Métis people in the Ottawa region.
Je crois que la plupart des individus viennent vers ces groupes-là avec des identités puis des motifs qui sont distincts, qui sont pluriels, multiples. Oui, il peut y en avoir des gens qui peuvent avoir des mauvaises intentions, mais c'est pas à mettre tous dans le même panier.
Daryl Leroux has a different take on the Métis movement. In 2019, he published a book called Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigenous Identity. Leroux calls these self-proclaimed Indigenous people race shifters. A professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, he doesn't hesitate to question the authenticity of these Métis groups in Eastern Canada.
Au Québec, j'en ai trouvé environ 30 à 35 qui sont présentement actifs. En Nouvelle-Écosse, il y en a environ 10. Au Nouveau-Brunswick, il y a 7 ou 8 qui vont en cours normalement pour accéder ou essayer d'accéder à des droits autochtones.
To obtain Indigenous rights as a Métis, having an Indigenous ancestor somewhere in your family and being a member of a Métis association are not enough. You have to prove that you belong to a historic Métis community.
Les droits autochtones au Canada sont des droits collectifs, uniquement. Si vous voulez avoir des droits, il faut que vous soyez une communauté et les droits vont être accordés à la communauté et non pas à des individus.
Denis Gagnon held the Canada Research Chair on Métis identity at the Université de Saint-Boniface in Winnipeg for many years. He sees Métis identity as a precious heritage that should be tended carefully.
Les Métis, ça peut être aussi bien la colonie de la Rivière-Rouge, peut être utilisé comme terme générique pour désigner quiconque possède des origines mixtes européennes et autochtones, et ce, partout au Canada.
A community that wants to obtain Métis rights must show that it has a shared culture and customs and traditions that constitute a Métis identity distinct from those of First Nations and Europeans, and prove that this tradition has lasted over time. That is the Pauli test set out in a Supreme Court decision.
Children, my grandchildren, can be like their ancestors, hunt when they want.
Steve Pauli and the Métis community of Sault-Sainte-Marie met this test successfully in 2003 and thus obtained Indigenous rights. This Supreme Court decision sparked the Métis movement throughout Canada.
Il y a beaucoup de membres de communautés au Canada qui vont lire les critères et qui se reconnaissent. Ils se disent, nous autres, on est comme ça. C'est ce qu'on a vécu, c'est notre histoire. Donc, ils se sont reconnus et se sont dit, on pourrait avoir des droits, nous aussi, comme à Sault-Sainte-Marie.
Nearly 110 associations in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada have gone to court, trusting that they would be granted recognition and rights, generally hunting and fishing rights. While Dominique Côté was chief of the Antaya Métis community, some of its members wanted to be able to produce maple syrup without having to follow the applicable regulations.
Moi, j'avais personnellement écrit à l'UPA. Ce que je lui demandais, c'était un quota particulier pour la nation. Mais ça a été refusé.
C'est juste une question d'argent encore là. Mais à force de répéter le mensonge, ils sont devenus des Indiens. Là. Dans leur cœur, là, ils se lèvent, puis la sauge, puis le pied part, hein, comme que disait l'autre.
Je vous présente notre danseur traditionnel de la nation, Mario Turgeon.
A traditional dancer, a council, a group of elders, all meant to help people find their roots and celebrate their culture. But they make it seem as if the Sartigan Nation is one of the First Nations.
Est-ce que c'est quelque chose que vous auriez fait dans votre tradition normalement?
Moi, je n'étais pas accueilli par un danseur de power de pas rapport. C'est très irrespectueux. Là. Le gars, le power, c'est une cérémonie.
Ces grands-mères autochtones, ils sont très, 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 très loin parce que toutes ces trois ascendances autochtones remontent au 17e siècle.
Dominique Richaud could not find any document showing that Dominique Côté's grandmother was Indigenous, as she claims.
C'est très difficile de faire les recherches amérindiennes. Non seulement c'est pas indiqué, mais ils changent de nom. On les efface, nés de parents inconnus. Vous savez, vous me dites, bon, votre généalogiste n'a pas trouvé ma grand-mère. Moi, je viens de la trouver dernièrement. Alors, c'est pour vous dire comment ça a été très, très compliqué.
Oui, c'est tout le temps nébuleux. Il y a tout le temps une histoire. Si quelqu'un, un autochtone, te dit c'est compliqué, ma généalogie, c'est pas compliqué, c'est parce que c'est un mensonge.
Il n'y a rien de caché ou de mystérieux. C'était vraiment là. Les gens devaient être recensés. Les gens voulaient savoir à qui ils avaient affaire aussi. C'est important aussi d'avoir un œil sur une population qu'on essaie de contrôler.
Il faut que tu acceptes comme métis.
Sébastien Mallette thinks that even people who have no Indigenous ancestors have the right to identify as Métis. He thinks that you have to go beyond genealogy and consider their way of living and how they see the world.
Les critères généalogiques, ça mène à des chasses aux sorcières, vous savez. Est-ce que vous avez véritablement ces ancêtres-là ou non? Est-ce qu'ils viennent très exactement des familles algonquines ou abénaquises?
According to public records, Sébastien Mallette's closest Indigenous ancestor was Saint-Foros Tapakwe, born in the 17th century. But Mallette says that this information is false and that he gives more importance to what his father told him.
C'est souvent le cas chez les Métis. En fait, je ne suis pas tout seul là-dedans. La plupart des Métis vont connaître une transmission culturelle familiale.
On a souvent cet historique-là, des histoires de famille où les gens disent « Ah, ma grand-mère nous disait qu'on avait du sang indien, etc., etc. » Mais souvent, c'est de mythologie canadienne, française, québécoise, qui est basée sur une ascendance qui remonte aux années 1600.
Lorsque vous vous affirmez comme métis de nos jours, automatiquement, vous tombez sous la loupe. Vous tombez sous la loupe, par exemple, de journalistes comme vous ou de spécialistes qui viennent vous voir et qui vous disent « Mais d'où ça vient? Qui exactement? Lequel? Ça fait combien de temps? T'en as-tu suffisamment? »
Le groupe Antaya émettait une carte.
Most Métis associations issue a membership card. Dominique Côté had one when she was chief of the Antaya community. These cards often resemble the ones that the federal government issues to status Indians. Some people make fraudulent use of their Métis membership cards to be exempted from taxes on their purchases, like a new car, for example.
On va vraiment créer la carte pour ressembler autant que possible à la carte réelle. Et on voit qu'il y a un montant de fraude dans l'utilisation de cette carte assez élevé.
Today, the Sertigan Nation no longer issues cards to its members, precisely because Chief Côté says that she had found some cases of fraud.
J'ai moi-même fait le tour des commerces avec un document sur la loi sur les Indiens expliquant à quel endroit a lieu la déduction. D'une part. L'autre chose que j'ai fait, c'est que j'ai communiqué aussi avec les gardes-chasse pour leur expliquer que tu n'as pas le droit de chasser et pêcher n'importe où au moment où tu détiens une carte telle que celle-là.
Shaman Luma Wakan is also a member of the Sertigan Nation.
À l'heure actuelle, on est une nation parce que la journée où on va signer notre entente avec le ministère des Affaires indiennes, nous reconnaissant comme titulaire de ce village-là, on va pouvoir devenir utiliser le mot Première Nation.
Et tout ça, c'est en cours, là.
To date, only the Métis community of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, has passed the Pauli test. All of the 110 other Métis groups have failed in their attempts to obtain legal recognition. In Quebec, the court case that got the most attention was heard in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. Ghislain Corneau had built a hunting camp on public land and refused to take it down on the grounds that he was Métis. 3 Métis organizations representing nearly 12,000 people joined him as plaintiffs to claim his Indigenous rights. After more than 11 years of litigation, the Superior Court of Quebec rejected their claims. In his decision, Judge Roger Banfort wrote that the evidence showed that Ghislain Corneau's self-identification as Métis was a fairly recent phenomenon, dictated by opportunism.
Je suis pas en train de dire qu'il n'y a pas de gens métissés, de personnes métissées qui sont autochtones. Évidemment, c'est le cas, là. Ce que je dis, c'est qu'il n'y a pas de peuple distinct métis.
Le problème, c'est qu'il y a eu des efforts par les gouvernements par le passé pour éteindre ces communautés-là, dont on demande aujourd'hui de faire démonstration de leur existence. Donc, il me semble que le gouvernement a un problème, à savoir de demander à des gens de prouver une identité qu'elle a tenté d'évacuer et même d'éliminer pendant 200 à 300 ans.
Peut-être c'est pour accéder à des droits de pêche, de chasse. Peut-être c'est pour accéder à des programmes d'emploi. Peut-être c'est simplement pour, un désir ambigu d'honorer ses ancêtres. Mais ce qui est important, c'est que les premiers peuples disent que ce n'est pas acceptable.
To become a member of a Métis association and have a card, you have to fill out a form. Provide proof that you have an Indigenous ancestor. Sometimes a simple declaration on your honor will suffice. And then pay a fee, which ranges from $40 to $260 depending on the association. You have to pay an annual membership fee. We wanted to see how easy or hard it is to obtain a card from an association. We asked a colleague to try to get one. As far as she knows, she has no Indigenous ancestry. Nevertheless, she filled out the form to become a member of the largest organization representing Métis people in Quebec, the Native Alliance of Quebec. Founded in the 1970s, the Native Alliance of Quebec has a long history of internal conflict. In the mid-2000s, it was on the verge of coming apart. The new chief, Guillaume Cal, was waging relentless war against some influential members of the organization. There were a number of raucous meetings and angry lawsuits. In the aftermath, Guillaume Cal went off and founded his own association. In 2018, it became the target of a CBC investigation. Chief Cal was recruiting members by having their DNA analyzed in a laboratory. The CBC was able to show that the laboratory's findings were more than questionable in the DNA of CBC staffers from Russia and India, and even in a sample of dog saliva. It found Indigenous genes, 12% Abenaki and 8% Mohawk. Guillaume Cal filed a defamation lawsuit against the CBC for this report. The Native Alliance of Quebec is the only association representing Métis in Quebec that receives federal funding. In 2020, it received over $1 million.
Si le gouvernement fédéral et les gouvernements provinciaux ne reconnaissent pas un peuple distinct métis à l'est de l'Ontario, au sud de l'Ontario, au Québec, etc., pourquoi leur donner des financements à ces organismes-là?
Que tu viennes, 4e génération ou 7e génération, tu es métis.
Robert Bertrand was also chief of the Native Alliance from 2011 to 2016. He was then elected national chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples.
J'ai eu une bonne discussion avec la ministre. Tu voyais là, qu'elle ne voulait pas nous voir là. Elle voulait pas nous...
In Canada, only the Métis of the Western Provinces and Territories and Sault Ste. Marie are recognized by the federal government as an Aboriginal people. The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples is a political organization based in Ottawa that fights for recognition of other Métis people throughout the country. The Congress says that it also represents all Aboriginal people living off reserve. The federal government gives the Congress nearly $5 million per year.
Et si vous vous définissez comme métis et qu'au fond, vous n'êtes pas indien, vous enlevez la place des Indiens.
André Maltais was a federal member of parliament and public servant for many years. He was the one who convinced Pierre Elliott Trudeau to recognize the rights of Aboriginal people in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In his opinion, organizations representing Métis people who are not officially recognized by Ottawa should not receive government funding.
Je comprends surtout pas comment ça fait qu'on reste là. C'est moyen de regarder ça comme... Et c'est pour ça que les citoyens ont bien tout mêlé et qu'on pense que les injustices, puis peut-être à raison.
By email, the Department of Indigenous Affairs told us that they are working with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples to advance the cause of reconciliation.
Est-ce que vous, votre descendance autochtone, vous dites que vous avez validé, ça remontait à où?
C'était... j'en ai sur les deux côtés, sur le côté paternel, sur le côté maternel.
Ils vont parler rapidement. Ils vont dire c'est de ma grand-mère, c'est du bord de ma grand-mère, mais là, ils changent de conversation vite parce qu'ils veulent pas trop qu'on rentre dans les détails. Parce qu'en réalité, c'est 12 générations de leur grand-mère, tu sais.
According to our research, Robert Bertrand's indigenous ancestry goes back to the 1600s.
Des gens sont mis en position de leadership, vont rencontrer le gouvernement fédéral à différents niveaux pour différentes raisons. Et comme vous l'avez dit, vont recevoir des millions et des millions de dollars du fédéral.
Robert Bertrand maintains that he has contemporary indigenous ancestors in his family, but he can't say who they are. He says that he trapped with his father from childhood, that indigenous blood flows in his veins, and that he is proud to be Métis. But let's come back to our colleague. She still hasn't received her card from the Native Alliance of Quebec, but she has been surprised to learn that she meets the criteria to obtain it. While filling in her family tree, she discovered that she had an Indigenous ancestor, a woman whose name is unknown and who married Jean Nicolette, a close associate of Samuel de Champlain, in 1629. The same ancestor as Dominique Côté, Eugénie Bouchard, Louis-José Houd, Pierre-Carl Péladeau, and even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Moi aussi, je l'ai dans mon ascendance. Cette femme-là, seule, a des centaines de milliers de descendants aujourd'hui. Donc, si toutes les personnes franco-descendantes se disaient autochtones aujourd'hui sur une base généalogique, on aurait environ 8 à 10 millions de nouvelles personnes autochtones au Canada et un autre 2 à 3 millions aux États-Unis. Donc, évidemment, n'importe qui peut se dire n'importe quoi. Si je veux me dire extraterrestre, je peux me dire extraterrestre. La question, c'est qui va te croire?
Moi, je me suis fait traiter de racisme, alors que j'essaie de dénoncer les gens qui s'approprient un peu l'identité autochtone.
Cindy Wilde is Algonquin and Atikamek. She has just retired after 25 years of working with Indigenous inmates. She wants to speak out against what she has seen at the Correctional Service of Canada.
On m'a approché pour occuper un poste qui existe toujours, qui s'appelle agent de développement auprès de la collectivité autochtone. Donc, ça a été le début des initiatives autochtones au service correctionnel.
The Aboriginal Initiatives Directorate was established to meet the needs of inmates from First Nations who are overrepresented in the penal system. For this directorate to carry out its mission, the Correctional Service of Canada needs Indigenous staff. For certain key positions, being Indigenous is even mandatory.
J'ai eu la chance d'être maman, puis j'ai eu des congés de maternité. Donc, à chaque retour de maternité, il y a des choses qui se sont produites. J'étais comme, il y avait des gens qui étaient devenus autochtones en mon absence, tu sais. Fait que des gens parmi mes collègues, là.
Cindy Wilde then realized that some of her colleagues had claimed Indigenous origins to get the jobs in question.
J'ai tellement entendu de mes superviseurs dire à quelqu'un « Ouais, mais toi, tu sais, t'as une ou deux plumes qui te poussent en arrière de la tête, là, fait que je pourrais te mettre sur ce poste-là quelques mois. » Tu sais, c'est des choses que j'ai entendues, puis je suis pas certaine que c'est des blagues parce que ces gens-là ont occupé ces fonctions-là.
Mais il y a certains postes qu'il faut être vraiment autochtone pour intervenir avec des détenus autochtones.
Dominique Launière belongs to the Malisit-Vigé First Nation, one of the 11 Indigenous nations recognized in Quebec. She, too, worked for the Aboriginal Initiatives Directorate.
J'avais une collègue qui était encore là dans la division des initiatives autochtones, qui est d'ascendance portugaise. Puis elle est autodéclarée Micmac.
Both Cindy and Dominique filed complaints about the situation with the Public Service Commission, but to no avail.
J'ai dénoncé ça pour que ça cesse, puis que les détenus puissent bénéficier des services qui leur sont réservés, en fait.
To qualify for a job that is open only to Indigenous people, you have to fill out a self-declaration form where you identify yourself as Aboriginal. The Correctional Service of Canada does not check any further.
Moi, je reviens toujours aux deux poids, deux mesures. Moi, je suis une Première Nation inscrite au registre des Indiens, puis je dois constamment prouver que je suis une Autochtone avec ma carte.
This same self-declaration form is used in all federal departments. The Quebec government uses a similar form. It's not just correctional employees who have good reasons to declare themselves Aboriginal. Inmates do too. Some of the benefits include more frequent visits, culturally responsive services, and the possibility of obtaining earlier parole, which creates some strange situations.
Un détenu qui s'autodéclare autochtone, puis que par la suite, il décide qu'il l'est plus. Fait que là, il dit à son agent de libération conditionnelle, enlève ça, décoche le autochtone dans mon dossier parce que ça me tente plus. Un autre cas, ça pourrait être un détenu qui s'autodéclarait Innu, puis 3 mois plus tard, il dit non, je suis plus Innu, je suis Mohawk. Il changeait de nation comme il changeait de chemise.
Elders play an important role in Indigenous culture. In the correctional system, they are hired to help rehabilitate inmates.
Ils sont hyper importants. En fait, je pense que c'est la clé que le service correctionnel aurait pu détenir pour travailler vraiment de façon positive la réinsertion sociale. Malheureusement, il est arrivé aussi dans cette sphère-là des autodéclarés qui ont nui au cheminement qu'on voulait faire aux initiatives autochtones.
Donc, c'est des aînés autodéclarés qui font passer des entrevues aux nouveaux aînés qui veulent être embauchés par le service.
A situation that is hard to believe. An elder who is not really Indigenous and a liaison officer who is self-declared as Indigenous on a form, working in a helping relationship with a prisoner who is no more Indigenous than they are.
Il y en a beaucoup qui ont quitté, malheureusement, des bons employés qui auraient pu faire la différence. Et il y en a beaucoup qui ont quitté avec cette amertume-là de dire, ben voyons, c'est quoi ça? On fabrique des Autochtones au service correctionnel.
The Correctional Service of Canada refused our request for an interview. By email, the service told us that all employees have the right to self-declare and that it does not have the power to determine whether someone is Aboriginal or not. It even said that the Correctional Service of Canada is proud to be the largest employer of Indigenous people in the federal public service.
Fait que les grands perdants, en bout de ligne, ce sont les Premières Nations, les Inuits, parce que la surreprésentation ne fait qu'augmenter et ils ne bénéficient pas des services auxquels ils ont droit. C'est encore là une discrimination systémique, à mon sens, à moi, qui est tellement flagrante, là.
Le fédéral a fait son travail, parce qu'il y a juste le fédéral qui peut définir si quelqu'un est indien ou métis ou inuit.
André Maltais has participated in many federal negotiations with Indigenous peoples, and in his opinion, Ottawa has to set out a clear definition of Métis identity.
On dit qu'il y a à peu près 500 000 métis. Si on a les nombres comme ça, c'est qu'on a les noms. Si on a les noms, on a leur histoire. Et si on a leur histoire, on peut vérifier la validité des uns des autres.
The two ministers for Indigenous Affairs and Indigenous Services, Carolyn Bennett and Mark Miller, refused to grant us an interview. By email, the Department of Indigenous Affairs said that it cannot define who is Métis and who is not. One of the reasons, a Supreme Court decision in 2016. In the Daniels case, Canada's highest court found that the Métis people come under federal jurisdiction. They are regarded as Indians within the meaning of the Constitution Act, but to secure Indigenous rights, they must satisfy the Pauli test before the courts. But on the question of Métis identity, the court remained silent. The court left it to the Métis people to define themselves. and to the federal government to decide.
La décision Daniels, c'est un peu comme un néant juridique, et ça demeure un néant juridique jusqu'à aujourd'hui, justement par manque de clarté.
So who is or is not Métis today? Are Métis people survivors of Canadian colonialism and assimilationist policies, or usurpers of Indigenous identity? The debate is likely to go on for some time. It rages on social networks, while the academic community remains divided.
Ce que je souhaite, c'est la production de matériel scientifique et historique plus adéquat sur la question. Je souhaite également la prise de dialogue pour que les gens puissent réaliser que les Métis au Québec ou ailleurs, c'est pas le bonhomme 7 heures.
J'ai toujours entendu dans ma famille des discussions.
But for Daryl Leroux, such a dialogue is impossible. He continues to see the members of the Métis movement in Eastern Canada as imposters.
Je pense qu'il y a de l'espoir que de plus en plus de Franco-Québécois, de Franco-Ontariens, etc., voient qu'ils sont en train de nuire au premier peuple, qu'ils font confiance au premier peuple, qu'ils leur disent « arrêtez de faire cela ».
Ils ont pris notre place. Nous, on est juste des gens qui doivent être dans le fond de leur réserve, puis fermez vos gueules dans le fond de vos réserves. C'est ça le message c'est ça qu'on vit présentement.
Moi, là, j'aimerais ça là, que ces individus-là vivent la vie que ma mère elle a eue, que mes tantes ou mes oncles ont eue. Je veux dire, c'est pas une vie de bénéfice, là, loin de là. Puis on leur a appris très jeune dans la vie que c'était pas super d'être autochtone au Canada, tu sais.
In Quebec and elsewhere in Canada, Métis associations are continuing to organize and to affirm their existence and their rights. If the Métis population continues to grow at its current pace, within 15 years, Métis people will outnumber First Nations people in Canada. Sooner or later, the government is going to have to deal with this growing phenomenon and try to find some solutions.
Good afternoon, I'm Melissa Ridgen. It's somewhat surprisingly messy and certainly contentious. There's always been a misunderstanding of what is or isn't Métis. The word has been used to identify a nation, a people, but it's also been used more loosely and is a French word for anyone who is of any mixed blood. In recent years, it's being used more and more with people claiming that they are Métis and as such are entitled to our rights. So today we are putting Métis identity in focus, and we want you to join in the conversation. Here's our phone lines. They're open. Call us toll-free, 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN in Focus. Before I introduce my guests to you, let's set the scene with a look at APTN's Investigates documentary by our own Todd Lamarand called Identity Crisis, which aired in November 2016.
It's who we are. It's natural. It's in our DNA. It's just things we do. Even as a child, it's just like our humor, our gathering, our social identity.
Haney lives in the Métis community of St. Lazare, a stone's throw from the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border.
We thrived. We're a big Métis community before even anybody came here. People got to understand that Métis is more than Aboriginal ancestry with European blood. It's history. It's the grassroots things. It's all that combined.
Haney believes there is only one true Métis who come from Western Canada.
But in all reality, though, the majority of the Métis people, they're in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta.
In Atlantic Canada, there are many who would say, no way.
I'm not First Nations, I'm not Inuit, so I'm Métis, I'm of mixed blood.
This is kind of, I think, a very important representation of Métis history, Métis culture. It's something like substantial.
Adam Gaudry is a self-described Red River nationalist.
It's important that Métis remain in charge of determining who is Métis.
And believes the term Métis is too widely used, especially when it comes to self-identification.
Like I said, there could have been mixed communities elsewhere, absolutely, but they didn't have the same kind of nationalistic understanding of the Métis Nation, and they didn't call themselves Métis, so why are we calling them Métis?
Dubé rejects the suggestion she's not Métis and rejects being called a non-status Indian.
And for me, a non-status doesn't exist. It's like a very gray area. Either you're First Nations, you're Métis, or you're Inuit, or you're nothing at all.
Garnet Purdy and his pals are getting ready for a clam bake.
The word Métis, I guess we've just used that probably for the last 20 years. This is where our families have lived on these Tusquet Islands for the last 275 years.
He says they're a mixture of English, Scottish, and First Nation.
We are always comfortable with half-bloods or half-breeds.
But that's not what they call themselves anymore.
We use that strictly now. I don't think you'll find anybody calling themselves a half-breed. They'll just use the word Métis. We're comfortable with it, and like I said, other people understand exactly what we're trying to say, who we are.
If one considers the word Métis as a marketing brand, it's been relatively successful.
A lot of the time, the Métis Nation is the standard in which these groups are trying to meet. And so using our terminology, which is now enshrined in law, they're aspiring to kind of become Métis on the scale that the Métis Nation is, and even though there's not the history for it.
Well, first off, let me assure you that we have been lambasted by the traditional Western media for this, and by Eastern media, Métis, for this but for very different reasons that they don't want to engage in this discussion unless it's online or under 140 characters or less, and often behind fake names. So everybody, it seems, wants to be Métis, but no one wants to discuss how being Métis is, or how it's determined, what makes Métis Métis. And if you want to hash it out, well, the Twitter trolls will come from you on either side. Tanya Dubé, who we saw a clip from earlier in that, she represents the Canadian Métis Council based in New Brunswick. She was invited to join us on our show, but in a press release today, she said that they would have to decline. The organization felt that the issue wouldn't get the attention that it deserves because Winnipeg is having a civic election today. And they also felt that a few days wasn't enough for them to prepare for the show. We will be hearing from people later in the show who had less than a few days to discuss the topic, but were able to offer their thoughts nonetheless. And in the business of news, we often hit up people within minutes of needing a comment for their perspective, just to be clear. The Métis National Council also wouldn't return requests to come onto this show to discuss the issue of Métis identities. So, joining us though, we have a controversial figure kind of in the middle of this Métis debate. His name is Darryl Leroux. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax. In recent years, he's begun to research this phenomenon of Eastern Métis groups in Quebec and the Maritimes. He's researched and written extensively on the subject, including white settler revisionism and the making of Métis everywhere, the evocation of the Métissage in Quebec and Nova Scotia, and a paper called Self-Made Métis that appeared in Maisonneuve. We also have joining us via Skype, Jason Madden. Where's Jason's here? He is a Métis lawyer who worked on much of the litigation and advanced on Métis rights and claims from Ontario westward over the past 15 years. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Melissa.
Did you get any grief about coming to have this chat?
I didn't mention I was on your show.
They just directed it this way, which is fine, Okay, well, let's just start, I guess, then because we've got people saying, we're Métis, and then you've got other Métis saying, that doesn't fit the definition of Métis. You aren't even Indigenous. You over there are Indigenous of some sort, but it's not Métis. You maybe are something and something else, but you're not Métis. Let's go to, and all of this has popped up in fairly recent time, right? Mm-hmm. Let's go right to what might be part of the problem, the 2016 Daniels decision. In the Supreme Court, it says there is no one exclusive Métis people in Canada any more than there is no one exclusive Indian people in Canada. The Métis of Eastern Canada and Northern Canada are as distinct from Red River Métis as any two people can be. Is this, and it goes on, but is this, do you guys think, the foundation of where we're getting the confusion over who is or isn't Métis? I'll let you go first.
Okay, I mean, I think that some of this social movement, I'm calling it a social movement, the Eastern Métis movement, definitely comes before Daniels. So I have generally identified it in relation to the Marshall decision. which was a decision in 1999 of the Supreme Court that decided that the Mi'kmaq had a right to make a moderate livelihood from the fishery. So in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, you see that Acadians start calling themselves Métis to access Aboriginal rights after Marshall, and actually as the court case is happening. So it's a movement that sort of predates what happens in Quebec by about 5 years in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And then it grows even more after Powley. So there's the Powley decision in 2003 where the Supreme Court again more or less decided that the Métis have Aboriginal rights under the Constitution, and also actually set up a test, a 10-point test in terms of Métis identity. After that, you see that the numbers grow significantly in Quebec and continue to grow at a really rapid pace in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
Well, I just read, according to census data, just to put this in perspective for our audience who may not know some of the backstory to this, from 2006 till 2016, the number of people who identify as Métis in Nova Scotia alone increased 125%.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in Nova Scotia,
10 years.
In 1996, there were 830 people who are identifying as Métis, many of them using the term to mean mixed race, not as a distinct Métis people. And then in 2016, there's over 23,000. So it went up 28 times in 20 years. Right?
Jason, what are your thoughts on this relatively new phenomenon of people claiming Métis identity in Eastern Canada?
I think it's a unique element of the kind of experiment getting out of the lab from the Powley case. The challenge for the Métis Nation historically has been government has not been willing to negotiate. So the Métis Nation turned to the courts to say, let's establish we have rights, establish we have claims. Now people from other locations are using those cases in order to, create Métis anew in areas where historic communities never were. They are not a part of the Métis Nation. And it really speaks to the same problem that First Nations have when the federal government starts to get into defining who an Indian is under the Indian Act. We now have the courts playing, and it's a double-edged sword. In one way, they're validating rights. In another way, they're creating these constructs that are not based upon a peoplehood analysis. They're based upon the facts the courts have before them in a specific situation. And you're not getting a principle-based approach. Now, and to a certain extent, you have this phenomenon happening. But the other thing, too, is it sucks the oxygen out of the room to really talk about the Métis Nation. There is no identity crisis in the Métis Nation. These groups have been, for over 200 years, been asserting themselves as the Métis Nation, using that term. They're the only ones that actually meet the criteria for peoplehood, a language, a culture, a collective consciousness. Their collective consciousness doesn't rise 20 minutes after the Powley decision comes down. And so I think that what you're seeing happening, and it is chickens coming home to roost to a certain extent. Governments didn't do their job and sit down and negotiate with the Métis Nation back in 1982. We've taken a series of cases to the Supreme Court of Canada, and now we have some of the residual mess that is created by the court not being able to do this in a principled way, only being able to do it based upon the facts before you. Where the Métis Nation has always been focused on this, though, is that those court cases were a reason to get to the table, to get to negotiating tables to finally negotiate these issues. As I said, the Métis Nation doesn't have an identity crisis. We know what communities are a part of us. We know who we are. We have for 2 centuries. The issue is now you have these other groups who read a court case and say, hey, that's neat, maybe I'll fit into there. And they have none of the antecedents of peoplehood. And it's embarrassing to a certain extent for those of us who have been involved in the court cases, because where this has turned now is unbelievable when you see how people are contorting what these court cases have said about validating Métis rights based upon people being distinct from Indians, being distinct from First Nations and Inuit, and trying to use this as essentially just any mixed blood person being able to claim their Métis. And it really is quite disempowering to the Métis Nation. And it is really quite a mess that the courts have made, not simply because these issues haven't been dealt with in the way they should be dealt with, nation to nation, government to government, with negotiations with the appropriate representative. We now have those peoples established, and hopefully that will further solidify, who the Métis are, the Métis Nation. But I think that this phenomenon isn't going away anytime soon, and I think it's good to expose it for what it is.
Why would these groups, there would have been room for these groups to pop up and say, we have the same rights, but as non-status Indians? There was room for them to come in there. Why did you think they're using Métis? Big M, capital Métis.
Well, because they see it as, and you, I think on the video before, you see it as this, well, I don't fit in here, I don't fit in here, I have an ever so great Indian grandmama, therefore I must be Métis.
Well,
that is so offensive to the Métis Nation.
Yeah.
And that is not who are a people. Now, let's just get this straight. Why Indigenous people have rights is they were here first. They were here prior to Canada becoming Canada, Manitoba becoming Manitoba, jurisdictions becoming jurisdictions. And that is what grounds their right. And they were here first, and they were a distinct people. And only the Métis Nation has those antecedents of peoplehood. And so the issue that you have is these people who, clearly don't want to be a part of their Anishinaabe relatives and want to create some groups anew. And it really does, it's colonization redux that you have ongoing of these, largely non-Indigenous settlers are now reprofiling themselves as Indigenous to access Aboriginal rights. Offensive to Indigenous, offensive to, and it is just common law.
Sorry, you're cutting out there, Jason. Earlier this week, so the whole notion of what is Métis, we put this to our viewers, our followers on social media earlier this week, and we asked, what do you think about the issue of Métis identity? Is any Métis person a First Nation, or is any Métis a person with a First Nation ancestor? We asked that. 66% said yes, and 34% said no. That's 66% of people polled say they believe if you have any Indigenous ancestor, you are Métis. So that shocked me and ruffled some feathers of Métis people who took issue with the question, not only with the question, but the response that it gathered. And I guess we're seeing a little bit of that here. If I have an ancestor 5 generations back who is Mi'kmaq or Algonquin, then I am present-day Métis. We gave people a few multiple choice answers, or a few multiple choices too. In another poll online, this is on our social media, that asked, who is Métis? 5% said anybody who has mixed blood. 79% said a person who's Métis has Métis parents, or at least one Métis parent. 16% said an Indigenous ancestor somewhere in your background makes you Métis. And 0% said that if you're married to an Indigenous person, you're Métis. I was happy to see that one was at 0. I was surprised to see some of the results in some of the other categories, though. Okay, so later in the show, we are going to get into the word Métis, the semantics of it. What type of noun is it? Should we be using small m Métis to describe some people, big M Métis to describe others? Are there non-status people misidentifying themselves as Métis? Should a new word be created for this Indigenous group of people who seem to distinguish, or the Métis distinguish as separate from themselves? But if your ancestry, it has just one Aboriginal person in it back in the 400 years ago, are you Indigenous at all? So we are going to take a break. We will be back with more to discuss Métis identity. Stay with us. Conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN in Focus, and send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca.
Just where do many of these Métis in the Maritimes come from? We start in a place called the Village Historique Acadien. In 1604, 79 French men established a colony in what is today New Brunswick.
Since they didn't knew how winter was hard here in Canada, they suffered greatly there, and half of the men died on that island and were buried there.
Families didn't start arriving until the 1630s and 40s.
Not everywhere, but some of them did marry between the two cultures. We don't have a Metis culture or Metis. That name or that signification is not here like it's out west.
Gregory Burke and his supporters disagree. They say the Acadian Métis began soon after colonization.
They didn't have any wives, and they married the Mi'kmaq wives. What come out of that were the children of mixed breed, the half-breeds.
Burke says that having one Mi'kmaq ancestor from that era is enough to make a person Indigenous today.
I mean, I always identified that I was Indian, and I only have one ancestor. So who has the right to say I'm not Indian? It's for our ancestors that had to suffer the genocide. It's for our ancestors that for hundreds of years they weren't recognized as the Indigenous people. And it's time that we do be recognized as Indigenous people.
That was another clip from Todd Lamoran's documentary Identity Crisis, which aired on APTN Investigates in 2016. Let's go to social media right now. We want to hear what you are saying about this topic. Catherine Guillaume, Métis is a French word meaning mixed Indian and European blood. It's crazy. I'm white. My husband is First Nations. Cree. My daughter should be Métis, but according to the government, she's not Métis. She's First Nations. She is First Nations. Let's see what Kelly had to say. My mom is Anishinaabe, and my dad is English-Swedish, and the amount of times people are telling me that I'm Métis are countless. That is a misconception that most people have. Thanks for that, Kellyanne. And now we go to Chloe. Métis would really define one parent being non-Indigenous, not grandparent, not a great-grandparent, etc. Sorry, guys, otherwise we will have more Princess White Ducks claiming their full-blood Métis status. And we go to Jennifer. If it isn't legally, then those of us of mixed ancestry should have some sort of designation as well. Why would mixed ancestry have been recognized hundreds of years ago, but not today? Robin. The Métis Nation is not a pan-Indigenous catch-all for mixed nations. You're related to the Michif language, ancestors, culture, and traditions if you're not. And we go to Barbara. Not from an Indigenous perspective, you aren't. Not from a Métis Nation perspective, you aren't. From a colonial perspective, some may believe, she's got the quotes, so still belief doesn't make it real. And Ryan, if you do not trace your family back to a Métis community, do not involve yourself in Métis culture or try to perpetuate our ways, why would you even want to claim Métis status and heritage? So that's all we have. So if you would like to add your opinion to this, of course you can. Here's how. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN In Focus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Chief Terrence Paul of the Member 2 First Nation on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, is co-chair of the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs there. Weeks ago, his group and the Métis National Council drew a line in the sand by signing a memorandum of understanding that essentially jointly dismisses claims that Métis exist in that province as a nation. He joined me earlier today from Nova Scotia. Here's what he had to say. Hi, Chief Paul. So you've spent most of your life in Member 2. You've been Chief of Member 2 First Nation for 35 years. When did the Acadian Métis come on your radar? Is this something you knew of Métis people in Nova Scotia growing up?
No. I mean, there's first I've heard of Acadian Métis. There's only Mi'kmaq here in Nova Scotia.
So when you've heard of Métis, it was people who are from somewhere else, not Nova Scotia.
Yes, they do. I mean, they have their own defined territory, the Métis that, and we've met with them, and they explained fully and fairly well who they are and where their territory is.
When did you first hear the term Acadian Métis? When did that first come onto your radar?
Well, we got feedback from the provincial government that there was people claiming Métis status and that they had cards that indicated that. So they expected to get the same rights as the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, which is not right, and that's not the case.
And when did this happen? When did you first hear from the province that there were people claiming Métis status and all of the rights that come with Section 35?
I'm saying about in the last couple of years.
So, because people have said this is a quote unquote new phenomenon, and you're saying when you grew up, you'd never heard of Métis out in Cape Breton, around Member 2 in Nova Scotia, and then just a few years ago, they came on the radar. So when did you and the Métis National Council get together on this issue?
We got together in October, early October. We've been having discussions before that, and we finally agreed that we would meet with the president here in Nova Scotia, and it was a very good meeting, and as a result, we developed an MOU to work together to ensure that the people that claim Métis status are actually Métis, and the Métis know themselves who they are, and they have a process that it's a rigorous process that they go through in order for somebody to be recognized as a Métis. Mm-hmm. And we have the same process here, and the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia are the only ones that can define for themselves who is Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. So that's our process.
And so what is the harm in people saying, look, we've done our genealogy, we've found that we have an ancestor who's Mi'kmaq, and we expect some rights. You can't just look and say, let these organizations take shape and make a challenge themselves and let the courts decide?
As I said, I believe that the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia are the only ones that can define for themselves who is Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia.
And the Métis are saying the same thing. And okay, so what about if what's been the blowback, I guess, or has there been any blowback since you and the MNC signed this MOU?
Sure. Like we got feedback from the organizations that they don't agree with what we're saying and what we're doing, and that's their that's their prerogative. But we still maintain that the Mi'kmaq are the only right holders here in Nova Scotia.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the time to share that with us. We really appreciate it as we're having this discussion here on In Focus today. Thanks so much, Chief Paul.
You're welcome.
I am still here in studio with Daryl Leroux, who has done extensive research into what some call a phenomenon of Quebec and Métis. And joining us now via Skype is Greg Burke of the Atlantic Aboriginal Nation, who has long asserted that Métis do in fact exist in the Maritimes and in fact predate the Red River Métis. He's joining us now. Greg, I'm going to start with you. I'm not sure if you could hear from your end what Chief Paul had just said, but I'm going to quote something. You used to be with the Bras-d'Or Métis, and I found this on their website. And I'm going to quote it to you and have you respond to it. Our Métis ancestors are the founding nation that forged the very foundation of the fur industry that catapulted the fur industry across this country from coast to coast, sharing their skills, tools, and knowledge of trapping and hunting to the western provinces as we know them today. So, you know, in Manitoba, the territorial acknowledgements, we recognize this is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, the Dene people, and this is also acknowledged as the homeland of the Métis Nation. You guys would argue that's not the case. The homeland of the Métis Nation would be the Maritimes.
No. The Western Métis have a homeland in the west, as we do here in the east. So there's nothing that I'm defining as we are the homeland of the Métis, because the Western Métis have their culture, which is very similar to ours, and we have ours. So I would define the homeland actually for the Métis of all of Canada, and that's how Louis Riel had seen it. That's how Gabriel Dumont had seen it, and that's how the Métis Federation of Canada sees it, and that is what as pole vaulted the MFC to organize the Métis from coast to coast to coast, because we're scattered, and the Métis, being the true nomads, claim that all of Canada is our homeland, because our homeland came from the French marrying the Abenaki, Wapano, Mi'kmaq, Cree, Crow, Blackfoot, and that's all through. So you don't, if you read history, you don't see Mi'kmaq marrying Cree or Crow or Blackfoot. What you see is the French, the Scottish, and German, whatever, traveling right across Canada, marrying the Métis, and we have Métis not only all across Canada from coast to coast to coast, but all in through the States. We have Métis, our ancestors are here in Louisiana, and they carry on the culture in Louisiana. Well, they have no contact with the Métis in the West, and they have no contact or very little contact with the Métis in the East, but they carry on the culture.
Okay, well, so there's, as Chief Terrence Paul and the
it's a shame to
MNC
see and
have to
hear this kind of disgruntle coming from the Western Métis, where really
it's not just from the Western Métis,
together,
it's from the Indigenous people right in your own province, the Mi'kmaq. I wanted to have your response to the MOU that was signed by the Métis National Council and by the Mi'kmaq chiefs of Nova Scotia, who they've just put out a MOU saying the Métis are not around here. You know, we talked to Chief Paul, who he's 35 years as chief at Member 2. He's born and raised in Nova Scotia. He's never, until recent years, he said, you just heard him say it too, until recent years, heard that there was any Métis people, as a people, settled in Nova Scotia.
Yeah. Well, that's sorry, did you have another question to that? Or?
No, I'm just wondering, so he's saying that you don't exist there, and the MNC is saying that too, so and you're saying you do, so I want to hear your response to their position.
That's his prerogative. You know, that's his prerogative. I mean, he lived on a reserve for 35 years, as he said, and of course, the Métis lived right across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and all through Canada and Louisiana, like I said. So, you know, if you haven't met a Métis, that's unfortunate. But our community was all of Lockadee, so all of Nova Scotia. So you know, we've been here forever. You know, I'm from a small town in Cape Breton, Glace Bay, and you know, I had Métis in my neighborhood.
Well, but if you've been there for a long time, how come people don't know of the Métis? Like, were you hiding? Were you just did you just blend it in with the rest of the people there? Because people say we don't know anything with these Métis who have been here all this time.
Yeah, we just come out of the closet, because in the 1500s, when the first mixed marriage happened here, and we have all kinds of records in the 1600s and 1700s with the mixed marriages, the Jesuit priests named the children Métissage, and that's how they were referred to. And in all of the historian records, they're referred to either as Acadian Métis, or Métis.
We're going to get to that, a little bit about that in a bit, the word Métis and how it's a French word that means of mixed blood of some variety, any variety. It could be, it's not specific to
Métis,
this.
Yes.
But we'll get back to that. We have a bunch of callers who are waiting patiently online, so if we can go to them right now. My producer Beverly will tell us who we have here. We have Will Goodon from Ottawa calling. Hello, Will.
Hi, Melissa. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. Just listening to some of your guests today, and you know, there's some good comments there, and there's some concerning comments as well. But it's an interesting topic for sure.
And what do you make of it? What you hear? I mean, you're well familiar with it. Will is Métis himself. I know this name from my time in Brandon, Manitoba. Will, you've been involved in Métis everything for as long as you've probably been walking on this earth. What do you think of this? Where we're at with this? I don't know if can we even call it this East-West divide? I don't even know whatever we call it. People are going to be mad. So
there's a few things that I think that need to be talked about, and I just want to commend Jason for some of the things that he brought up in his discussion. So I just wanted to start with a couple of quick points here, and the first one being is that we're not Métis. We're not the Métis Nation. We're not Métis Nation citizens because we're mixed. In fact, I would argue that being mixed is not even a marker of being Métis, that we are Métis because we are descended from Métis ancestors. The Métis are a distinct people. We developed in Western Canada over centuries. Jason spoke very correctly about this, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People supports this idea of nationhood, of peoplehood. And it definitely doesn't say that blood makes a people or a drop of blood makes a people. What makes a people is things like community, things like culture, language, food, music, dance, clothing. All these things are markers of a people. And the Métis Nation, thankfully has these things that have developed, like I said, over centuries. And now we can definitely point to things like the infinity flag that was flown by Cuthbert Grant, which I see in Nova Scotia. And I wonder how Cuthbert got over to Nova Scotia. It's very confusing to me. Things like the fiddle, things like the sash. And I have watched this phenomenon for a while. And I've talked to a couple of people, and, the idea of community is an interesting one. There's no doubt there's Métis Nation communities throughout Western Canada, but what I see is actually there is a community developing. But it's a virtual community. It exists on Facebook. It exists on Twitter. It exists on social media. But I would, very much, and I have a lot of people and actual Indigenous people who live in those territories are saying they don't see any Métis communities, but it's now existing in virtual reality.
That's interesting. That's an interesting point to make. Well, we are going to have to let you go. We've got another person on the line who has. Thanks for taking the time to give us a shout. I appreciate that. Always good to hear from you. Now we have Cade from North Dakota who's here with a question. Hello, Cade.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Great. I guess I have a statement as, also a question maybe that Daryl could speak to afterwards, but I'm looking at this, and the focus of Métis identity is to an affiliation with the traditional Métis homeland, historical and current Indigenous kinship with the Métis Nation, and community acceptance. It's not just having a distant ancestor. Without that kinship, community, culture, and homeland, it's illogical to claim to be Métis simply on blood. I think that the connection with the historic and modern Métis community needs to be established, and it doesn't matter if you declare yourself to be a chief, to start your own organization and say that you're representing Métis people, or just that you feel that Métis exists from coast to coast to coast, as Chief Burke said. But at the end of the day, you just aren't Métis without that. You need to have that community and that historical connection.
So, I'll leave this to you. Daryl?
Well, I'll just pick up, I guess, on that last point. One of the things that I've discovered doing this research, I have accessed over 5,000 individual genealogies that are used by organizations. So they basically presented them in court cases. And looking through those 5,000 genealogies, and these are genealogies of Eastern Métis organizations and individuals who are claiming that identity, 80% of those over 5,000, the individuals are relying on a woman in the 1600s as the basis for their Indigenous identity. And in many cases, and what I found actually is that 30% of those of the overall claims, the individual has no Indigenous ancestry. Because what happens is there's a bunch of French women, particularly in Nova Scotia and Acadia, who are turned into Indigenous women for the purpose of this movement. And this is stuff that they present in court as evidence of their existence, right? So even the three largest organizations in Quebec right now, I've seen their records, And 30% of their members have no Indigenous ancestry whatsoever. And they start as movements against Indigenous people's rights. That's actually the people who end up founding these organizations in 3 different regions in Quebec. They're actually founding white rights organizations and associations, and also sort of fomenting violence against Innu people and Mi'kmaq people in different regions.
And proclaiming to be Métis.
Afterwards, after Paoli.
But having no Indigenous ancestry whatsoever, never mind Métis ancestry.
In 30% of the cases
30% of the cases.
Yeah, and in the other cases, most people, we're not talking about a few generations away. We're talking about, on average, 9 generations away. But for most, it's actually 12 generations.
Wow.
I'm one of those people.
You're one of those people. So 12 generations back, you could find...
I have Indigenous 3 Algonquin ancestors in the 1600s who I'm related to 3 of their children who are born between 1664 and 1679.
3? So you've got more than a lot of what these people claiming
I have more than 75% of the members that I've seen.
So you're Métis by this definition?
I could join any of the organizations, yes.
And do you identify as Métis?
No, absolutely not.
What do you identify as?
I'm French Canadian. That's what I've grown up as. I hunt and I fish just like my family have, but in no way does that make me Indigenous. My family has maintained no connections, no relationships with actual Indigenous people, and often actually express animosity towards Indigenous peoples as white people.
Yeah.
And that's more or less what I've discovered in the research I've seen.
We got to take another break. It feels like we need to have 2 hours for this discussion. We got to go to a break, but we are not done hashing out what is or isn't Métis, who is or isn't Métis. Please stay with us. We are coming back. Hello, welcome back. In case you're just joining us, we are putting Métis identity in focus. There are numerous groups emerging in Quebec and the Maritimes saying that they are the original Métis and predate their Red River Métis cousins or brothers or sisters by hundreds of years. But established Métis groups on the prairies say no way. And as we've mentioned, the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs and the Métis National Council have drawn a line in the sand, signing a memorandum of understanding that says they reject these claims to the idea of Métis, Eastern Métis. We've been discussing what's at the root of this and what's at stake for all involved. Chantal Fiola is Métis and an assistant professor in urban and inner city studies at the University of Winnipeg. She teaches about this very topic, Métis identity. So our producer here, Beverly Andrews, caught up with her between classes to find out what it is that she teaches about who is and isn't Métis.
In addition to self-identifying as Métis, you need to be able to prove prove a connection to historic Métis communities, recognized historic Métis communities. So that's usually in a certain kind of geographic homeland. Also, contemporary acceptance by, again, recognized Métis. So that could take the form of MMF citizenship, MNO citizenship, and being distinct from other Indigenous nations. So not First Nation, not Inuit. This is a controversial and could be a very painful topic. When people say they're something and you tell them they're not, it feels like the rug's being pulled out from under them. But we can't lose sight of how this is impacting Métis nationhood and self-determination. You know, the part of the definition of nationhood and self-determination is that a group has the right to determine its own citizenship and lobby the government, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all getting confused because of non-Indigenous Canadians with the one ancestor 200 years ago saying that they should have a right to speak in Supreme Court cases that are affecting Métis people across the country. I would say that if you only have one ancestor from 200 years ago, it's inappropriate to call yourself Métis and to even try to find like justification or legitimize your claims to Métis nationhood. Folks like that these are non-Indigenous Canadians with an Indigenous ancestor.
We are still joined in studio by Daryl LaRue. He's a researcher at the center of this storm. And I'm wondering if Greg is still on Skype with us?
I am, yes.
Okay, good, Greg. We're going to take some callers right now. We have Jean Paul from Bathurst, New Brunswick, who's on the line. Jean Paul, how are you?
Good.
Good. What are you phoning in here for?
I just want to remind your guest there that I think he called himself a Mi'kmaq. But if you look in the Treaty of 1726, the ratification, you should know that. I think there were 72 chiefs that signed on that, and they were all Métis, all French names. Okay? And in that treaties, every Métis here in the East have been recognized by the British and by the Mi'kmaq themselves, because it's said on the treaty for their natural descendants. So it doesn't matter, and to back that up too, you can look at the Colonial Act of 1850. They say the same thing. Even if you're a Métis, you're considered an Indian. So that's just a game that the Mi'kmaq's playing right now, and the Métis in the West try to pretend that there's no Métis here. All Mi'kmaq here are Métis. I don't know why they don't understand that, or they don't want to go along with that. But I'm in court now with no lawyer for the last 8 years, and the government doesn't want to start the court right now. But believe me, I'm going to go to the end, and it cost me $20,000 of document to go in court, and I got all certified paper that I can prove that all Mi'kmaq in the East here are Métis.
And I see you have Greg is nodding in agreement with what you're saying there. I mean, Greg, so if you're saying that the Métis in fact do exist, it's been acknowledged, I mean, I guess I would ask, where were you guys when we were fighting out here? We could have used some backup.
Well, and I agree with you 150% on that. And I think a lot of it was a lack of leadership and a lack of organization. And going back to Terence Paul, he said that he hadn't heard of any Métis in the Maritimes until a couple of years ago.
Well, I took over, I organized the Métis community in Ayrshad, St. Peter's, Pointe-à-Luce, and that area there. And when I started to come forward with the help of the MFC, who, by the way, are all Western Métis. Everybody on the board is Western Métis. It became more prevalent, and we were in the news. But I think a lot of it, and I agree with you, yes, in 1982, my brother and I followed the court case very closely back in 82, and yes, there should have been a leadership, and they should have been involved, and they should have been in court. But I just want to touch on John Paul. He jumped ahead of me here with the treaty. The treaty clearly states that we were recognized as Indian. Our ancestors did the negotiations for those treaties. Our names are all over them. That's why a lot of Mi'kmaq took our names, because we married into their families and they have English names. And at the end of it all, the treaty pretty well stipulates where we're defined.
Okay, I'm going to go to Daryl now. This is not my wheelhouse. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. Daryl, you've spent a lot of your professional life looking into this. I'm curious about your take on this treaty.
Well, I mean, this is repeated over and over again. First of all, to Greg Burke's claim that the first child born to a mixed-race marriage was called métissage. That didn't happen. There's no documents from 1604 that state that. Métissage did not mean what it later come to mean in the 1700s. In France at the time, métissage meant something completely different. So that doesn't make sense linguistically if you actually look at the basis of that term at that time in history. Second of all, this claim by Jean Paul that a distinct Métis people signed the treaty, right, is completely false. The people who are in the treaty are representatives of the Mi'kmaq. Some of them happen to be mixed race, right? Now what's happening is these folks who are claiming to be Acadian Métis are going back to those documents, pointing out that certain people are Métis, meaning mixed race, and that therefore they signed the treaties.
Okay, why can't they just go back at this word métissage? Why can't the Acadian Métis say, we are métissage? What Métis has come to mean to most of Canada is one thing. Why don't you start from the ground up and say, we are a different group that falls under the umbrella of Indigenous. We don't like being called non-status. We don't like being called mixed blood. The Métis as they are now, after
Yeah.
the fights the Métis have said, we're not accepting you into
Yeah.
our own. Why don't you start this other group? Why can't it be called Métissage and start from the ground up and build your nation that way?
Well, first of all, I disagree that these folks are indigenous for the most part, if they're claiming that a Mi'kmaq ancestor in the 1600s makes them indigenous. As you heard, the Mi'kmaq do not recognize another indigenous people in their territory.
Right. Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
Right? So if we're going to respect the right to self-determination that indigenous peoples have, especially in this case where we're making claims that a people who the Mi'kmaq didn't even recognize then signed a treaty on behalf of the Mi'kmaq. That doesn't actually make a lot of sense, and this is another sort of way in which history is being revised.
Okay.
People who are mixed race in the past, if they're Mi'kmaq or if they're Algonquin, which are two cases that I've seen, they automatically all of a sudden become Métis, and the basis for a distinct Métis people out east. When those people at the time identified themselves as Mi'kmaq or Algonquin and were identified by their own community that way.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not true. What Daryl LaRue is trying to spin here, when he said that the first baby born in 1601 wasn't called Métissage, it never happened. Well, Naomi Griffiths is a well-known author who all her research is backed up by records, and she has written in one of her 14 books that, in fact, I know you're nodding your head, Daryl, but I listened to your lectures, and you don't. I'm really at awe here, as you don't know our history at all, but you want to speak about it.
Right.
And I'm glad you agree with that, because at the end of the day, Naomi Griffiths is a professor at a retired professor at Carleton, well-known author. All of her books, if you read her 14 of her books, every one of them backed up by records from the French and from the British.
We are going to be getting cut off here pretty quickly. I wanted to say, too, Daryl, what I find fascinating about you is that this is your area of research. You don't have a dog in the fight. Greg had just said, you don't speak for us. I liked you as you weren't here with a dog in the fight. That is all the time we have for today. Always, we thank you for joining us to discuss these important issues on In Focus. This episode will be available for download as a podcast on our website at aptnnews.ca/podcast. And if you missed any of the shows and want to catch up, you can check out the website, aptnnews.ca. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining us today. I appreciate everybody's perspective as we discuss this.
Thanks.
Say goodbye to the dog.
Say goodbye to the dog. Like I have to get the last word in. Whatever that is. So there are a number of discussions, and like Lost Sue said, this has been an issue that's gone on for some time. This is not something new, and really, it's not something new. So the reason that this stream came up today was that I shared an event yesterday, which of course was about art and teaching, that took place at Western University here in London, Ontario. And the moderator during that uh, event said, said that she didn't really want to stop the event, primarily because she knew that there were protests going on right on the university property, and they had a group of Métis people who are fighting for Bill C-53 that would allow them, first of all, recognition by the federal government as an indigenous group. One of those people that led the 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 fight for this recognition um, said that nothing's going to change. Um, I guess the problem with that nothing is going to change comment is that it's not true. Um, because once they get acknowledged, recognized, and a treaty has been established, they then have rights to land claims and other benefits, treaty benefits that our First Nations people in Ontario already have. And when you consider that it takes so much work for us to get funding for the basic necessities that we have to deal with already, to have another group jump in there and say that they also want those same rights becomes a an issue. I'm sorry, Screambleed, I did not see your text or messages. Okay, I'm confused because do I know you? I think I think that you not here. Wow, takes all kinds. Anyway, um, so here's that's essentially the issue that we're kind of dealing with is that there are only a certain amount of resources available to the indigenous people as it is, and to have another one or two groups of people come in and try to take away from some of the resources that we have that we've had to fight so hard to get to begin with is part of why there's an opposition to this. So I will share um, a clip on that um, after this one. This one is there's uh, an author and person named Drew Hayden Taylor who's been doing a number of documentaries about various things, and one of the ones he's put here. Let me see if I've got this right first of all, because I want to make sure I'm sharing the right one. Not what I was thinking it was here. Let me skip that. I'm actually going to go to the press conference. I have a press conference that was done yesterday of the group of First Nations people who have been combating the um, the BOC C-53, and so you can see their perspective as to why we're combating this. So let me get my mug off the screen here, and we'll get this one started. This is the press conference. First Nations leaders were holding a press conference yesterday about the, the 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 Bill C-53 and what it means and why they are opposing it. And Claire Bird, by the way, Yonko for the raid, and Dougie Fresh, Yonko for the 1,000 bit um, cheer. I appreciate that so much. And ZX 223 resub now for 3 months, and Chrysanthemum resub for 9 months. So thank you all for your support. I appreciate that so much. So here's the press conference that was released yesterday.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Name is Chief Wilfred King from Gull Bay First Nation. I'm here with the Ontario delegation, along with a representative from Manitoba, and we're here to speak against Bill C-53. First Nations are the original inhabitants of the lands and the region now known as Canada, and First Nations signed solemn treaties with the Crown. We have established inherent and treaty rights which are recognized under Section 35 of the Constitution. Ontario and Canada continued advancement of relationships and agreements with groups making false claims to Indigenous identity are directly impacting Aboriginal and treaty rights protected rights of recognized First Nations. First Nations in the Ontario region support the legitimate claims of Indigenous peoples, but note that recognition of unfounded claims undermine legitimate inherent right holders. We are protecting our inherent rights given to us by the Creator and reject any claims of lateral violence. This is about preserving the legitimacy of Indigenous rights. First Nations strongly support recognition of rights but reject the creation of any rights by Canada for groups that never existed historically as culturally distinct, stable political entities. First Nations in Ontario region have long opposed Métis rights assertions in our ancestral and territorial territories. We are in the position that the communities represented by the Métis Nation of Ontario never existed in our territories historically and therefore cannot be recognized as having Section 35 rights. First Nations in the Ontario region have long raised concerns about M&O's claims, and we have provided economic research that shows that the M&O claims rely on changing the identities of First Nation individuals in the past into Métis simply because they are of a mixed race. M&O claims to pop-up Métis communities throughout Ontario have no factual or legal basis and undermine the legitimate First Nations, Inuit, and Métis rights holders. R versus Poly recognizes the existence of one Métis community in a very specific, limited geographic area. There is no credible basis for claims elsewhere in the province. Canada's position is that because Métis have found to exist in a specific geographic location areas, Canada has now unilaterally created new Section 35 rights holders out of mixed race individuals claiming to be Métis, without proof of continuous, stable, culturally, and politically distinct communities in specific geographic areas. Our position is that R versus Poly, which is a Supreme Court of Canada decision, is being misapplied, misconstrued, and applied throughout various parts of Ontario without any kind of legal or factual recognition. I'll turn it over to our youth rep now.
Sego Sewagwego, Ariel Yunjet, Wataganagare. Hello, everybody. My name is Ariel Berwick, and I'm from Watson Mohawk Territory. I thank the Algonquin Nation, whose unceded lands we are gathered on, for graciously welcoming us to their territory. I thank the Elder for the prayer that was held earlier today, and I recognize the sacred items that were present with us on Parliament Hill today. Today we had gathered not only as individuals, but as a united front, a testament to our shared history and the principles we hold dear. I acknowledge Interim National Chief Joanna Bernard, Ontario Regional Chief Glenn Hare, First Nations leadership, our citizens and allies who have come together to oppose Bill C-53 and call for its defeat. I extend a warm and welcome to all citizens who have joined us at this rights assertion rally hosted by the Chiefs of Ontario. We also acknowledge the tireless dedication of the Chiefs of Ontario staff and the unwavering commitment of our leadership and citizens who have traveled to Ottawa at this critical point in time. Your presence here is a testament to our unity and sends us a powerful message. First Nations are united and are resolved to kill this bill. I also extend our gratitude to the Manitoba Métis Federation, Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, and Métis Nation of British Columbia for supporting the Chiefs of Ontario. As First Nations youth, we stand with legitimate Métis people whose rights and identity are also being trampled on by the Métis Nation of Ontario. The Ontario First Nation Young People's Council has consistently stood in opposition to Bill C-53 and supported the efforts of Ontario Chiefs to defeat the MNO's false claims. In June of 2022, we worked closely with our respected elders to provide advice on the initial Métis Rights Assertion Resolution passed by the Ontario Chiefs in Assembly. Let us be clear, the claims made by the Métis Nation of Ontario on our traditional territories are not just misleading, they are dangerous and unlawful. These claims put the rights of our children and future generations at risk. The MNO's assertions are rooted in falsehoods, and they aim to challenge our inherent rights and sovereignty. The MNO's claims are deeply offensive. However, we as First Nations do not need to prove our rights and title because they are inherent, given to us by the Creator. We know our laws and our responsibilities. No piece of Canadian legislation can grant or take away what is inherently ours. It is imperative for the Métis Nation of Ontario and governments at entry level and all levels to understand that First Nations in Ontario are the sole holders of inherent and treaty rights within our territories. Our culture, our identity, and our history are linked to these lands. In June of this year, we proudly stood alongside the Chiefs in supporting their call for a debate on this legislation, and we stand here today united in our resounding message, kill the bill. Chiefs of Ontario reached out to young people from all across the country, inviting them to join us in this critical endeavor to call upon the government to reject Bill C-53. We had gathered here today as a testament to our unity, our resilience, and our unwavering commitment to protect our rights and heritage. We do so not only for ourselves, but for the generations that will follow in our footsteps. Together we will stand firm in our resolve, and together we will make it known that Bill C-53 has no place in our future. Nyalwa, thank you, and may our determination and unity guide our path forward. Kill the bill.
Miigwech. My name is Greg Sarrazin. I am the chief of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation. I want to make it clear that the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan vehemently oppose Bill C-53. Bill C-53 is a piece of legislation that's put forward and completely ignores the laws in Canada right now as dictated by R versus Poly, which sets a criteria to outline how Métis communities can exist and how they can exercise Section 35 rights. Bill C-53 is creating a slippery slope of false claims to Indigenous identity that will not only affect First Nations in the Ontario region, it'll affect all First Nations across this country, something we all need to be very concerned about. This bill is setting a dangerous precedent where any group of mixed ancestry individuals can claim to be Métis and get Section 35 rights, opening the door to false claims across the country. In the past few years, we've seen a major increase in groups that are self-identifying as Indigenous who are asserting that they should have the same rights as First Nations. We have always had to fight extremely hard to have our rights recognized and upheld. We take attacks on our rights extremely seriously, and that is why we have gathered here this week to stand in solidarity to protect our First Nations rights. First Nations in all regions will be aware of the growing spread of groups falsely claiming Métis or First Nation status on the basis of a distant ancestry. Canada's position is that First Nations don't have any legal basis to challenge these decisions. It is between Canada and a new group. Canada's actions will only encourage groups asserting false claims across the country. Given the lack of territorial limitations in Bill C-53 and Canada's move away from the need for alleged Métis groups to show credible proof for their claims, it is entirely possible that MNO or other groups will seek to establish new so-called Métis communities in Quebec, British Columbia, and other provinces and territories. Even prior to the Bill C-53, MNO and other groups like the Métis Nation of BC have been making outrageous claims that they are equally entitled to First Nation lands under the Constitution. The Bill C-53 will only encourage illegitimate groups like the MNO to escalate their demands. Just because someone is half First Nation and half European does not mean they automatically cease to be First Nations persons and become Métis. Many of our people have one parent that is First Nations and one that is not. That does not make them Métis. It makes them mixed. but they are still First Nations. It is important to clarify that there is a difference between mixed and Métis. These are two different things, and the terms should not be used interchangeably. On June 21st, Canada introduced Bill C-53, the recognition of certain Métis governments in Alberta, Ontario and Saskatchewan, and Métis Self-Government Act into Parliament. First Nations have been left in the dark and repeatedly been denied any opportunity to even discuss the issue with Canada. We have serious concern about the implications of Bill C-53. Bill C-53 would enshrine into law the Section 35 protected status of any community represented by MNO based on membership criteria determined entirely by MNO. The MNO's membership practices have been scrutinized for years, not only by First Nations in the Ontario region, but also by other Métis people, including the Manitoba Métis Federation. The Métis National Council have passed a number of motions calling for an expert panel to review the so-called historic Métis communities in the Ontario region and determine whether the MNO's claims are authentic or not. That panel was finally established this month and the review is underway. We look forward to seeing the outcome. We want to make it clear that this is not just a small group of disgruntled First Nations chiefs in Ontario. These are legitimate concerns held by various groups across the country. We are calling for Bill C-53 to be withdrawn so that there is a proper and due diligence by Canada in consultation with First Nations before any bill of this magnitude is passed to prevent a mistake that will harm legitimate right holders for generations to come and plague governments for generations to come as well. Any questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Chief Elwood Zastry from Musqueam Peak First Nation, also Grand Chief of Swampy Creek Tribal Council from Manitoba. I come here today to support the Chiefs of Ontario for Bill C-53. First Nations are the original people of all territories commonly known as Canada. Our rights to self-determination encompasses land, water, and resource rights. Our rights to sustain ourselves and thrive from our lands and waters precede Canada and the United Nations itself. Nevertheless, our inherent rights, people, and nations have been affirmed by Canada and the United Nations. Our inherent rights as First Peoples and nations of this land to sustain ourselves and to prosper from the traditional lands, waters, territories encompass virtually of all Canada, apart from the Inuit territories. Bill C-53 is not a complaint with S-35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, nor the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, nor Canada's international treaties and First Nations. If passed, Bill C-53 would violate First Nations rights under the Constitution and under the international laws. It would be a grave injustice for Canada to enact this bill that violates our collective rights while simultaneously failing to respect the First Nations' inherent sovereignty and jurisdictionary and supersedes all others. There are many objectionable aspects of this bill, starting with the object and the purpose, which is to subsume the rights of the First Nations to those claiming Métis identity. And let us remember that Métis would never exist without First Nations in the first place. Section 7 of Bill C-53 makes it clear by subjecting all First Nations rights affirmed by legislation, including those the federal UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, to Bill C-53. But make no mistake, Section 7 is not only a problem with this bill. We wish all Métis people no ill. However, there are certain facts of life. Métis rights, even those who are true Métis, cannot supersede the rights of First Nations. Any claim to lands or self-government in relation to lands, waters, resources in Canada made by anyone claiming Métis identity are necessarily superseded by the rights of First Nations who have inherited rights literally dating to time immemorial. Meaning First Nations rights to land, water, resources are as old as human memory and existence in this territory and precedes the history of other people. There is another development problem that must be addressed, that this increasing number of fraudulent claims to nationalhood and Métis identity in different parts of Canada. There are Pretendians who claim to be Métis and Indigenous identities that is fraudulent. That is not grounded in any proper sense of what people or nation is. They're individual likewise, claiming in collective identity the rights that are not theirs to claim. Membership in the nation is not established by genealogy or DNA testing, finding one's indigenous ancestors. 8 generations back, a Canadian with a grandmother who was a French citizen, 8 generations back cannot go to France and claim French citizenship. This is not how nationhood works. Phony so-called Métis claims are arising in BC, Ontario, Quebec, and other places in Canada, in addition to individual pretendians and pretend to be Métis. This is not a problem the Crown can ignore any longer, and Bill C-53 will absolutely aggravate the problem while violating an undetermined First Nations collective rights and title. First Nations fought hard over the entire history of Canada to secure information and protection for our collective rights and a title as people of the nation in Canada and internationally. We will not stand by while anyone tries to undermine and take away those rights from our own benefit without our consent. And we do not consent to Bill C-53. We will fight, and we will expect all parliamentarians to support us in our position. I'm from Manitoba. We're having a problem there right now with the Métis Federation. They're claiming our lands, and they're holding our lands on us when we're trying to make economic development. They want us to go speak to the Métis and ask them for our lands, and it's not right. This land belongs to us, First Nations. We have a treaty right to this land, and we have to ask those people. And I don't know why it's happening. It's the federal government gave them the power under Section 35 to hunt, fish, and trap, which now every person in Manitoba is claiming Métis because they have that right to do that. And a lot of them are just fraudulent claims. So we have to do something. That's why I'm here today to support the Ontario Chiefs. Me as a Grand Chief, I have to speak for my people and stop this, because it's going to affect my children in the long run and my great-grandchildren. When I'm no longer here, I'll be in the spirit world, and they will be here. And they're going to ask, why didn't our chief speak up for us at the time? So that's why I'm here today. Thank you very much for listening. Miigwech.
Kwekwe. Chief Shelley Moore Frappier, Tamagami First Nation. I think that when we talk about land, the MNO is saying that this is not about land, and so is Canada, but it is about land. It's always about land. That is what we are as Indigenous people. We're tied to both kin and land. And in our homeland, in Document-On right now, we have served the MNO an eviction notice for an unauthorized cabin that they have built in our homeland. So you see, this is about land, and it's disingenuous to say it is not about land. And we will stand up, and we are standing up, and we are on the land to protect it. And this is not the only way that they are making claims to land. They're making IBAs with proponents in our homeland. They're making a lot of claims, but they're saying that this is not about land. But absolutely it is. So, miigwech.
Well, again, miigwech to everybody, and the support that was given to us to be in front of the big house here. We are really getting not desperate, but we do have to protect what the Creator had given us. So when we talk about the Métis and the Bill 53, I've been meeting with and we're meeting in different places with the Métis. I am, and I come to sit at some of these tables where they're very aggressive. They're aggressive with my chiefs. I will not let that. And they were bullying one of my chiefs. I will not let any one of them bully my chiefs. And the other thing is, sure, they're recognized by the government, which is what we've been asking for all our lives, that as long as I've been around and before, and we're still fighting to be recognized here. And for them to say, because I specifically asked the Métis people at a table I was sitting at, when my chiefs and all the chiefs sit with the government, federal or provincial, when we talk about compensation, settlements, funding, whatever it is when it comes to resources, that they truly believe that they must be at them tables. Well, no, that's the wrong answer. We deal and we work, and that is with the feds and the province, not with the Métis. They have no business whatsoever to be at these major tables where my leadership want to make our communities better. They have no business there. So we got to kill the bill, and we got to kill it now. And nothing about us without us is my theme every day now when I wake up. Miigwech.
We have time for questions now as well.
Hi, Brett Forster with CBC Indigenous. My question is for Regional Chief Glenn Hare. I spoke to the MNO's president, Margaret Crow, yesterday, and she said she wants to resolve this dispute through respectful dialogue with First Nations. You're painting a very different picture of how those talks have been going. So how open are you to negotiating with the MNO to resolve this?
Well, she needs to talk to my chiefs. I will not sit at a table by myself with the Métis. It's my chiefs. I take the direction from my leadership, and we've been open though. We have been open to sit with them, and they haven't. And why now at the 11th hour? We put a lot of resources out today to be here, to be heard. And if they're hearing us, then call my chief then. Let's like you just heard here, you know, we're not shunning them. But also at the same time, don't disrespect us.
And
I can add to that. In 2021, we sent a letter to Margaret Froh and to talk about the concerns that we had, and there was no response from her. So it seems to be at the 11th hour that when all of this is happening, that she all of a sudden wants to talk, and like our ORC has said, she needs to be talking to us, the right holders. So that's it.
And my follow-up question is again for Regional Chief Hare. I know you mentioned that there have been meetings with parliamentarians this morning. You're trying to get the bill halted. How confident are you've been heard today and that parliamentarians will actually stop the progress of this bill?
Well, we're not going away. You know, they're already mentioning treaties too. What treaties? They have no right to treaties. We have the Williams Treaty in southeastern Ontario right now, where the treaties are being breached, and that's the Greenbelt matter, the issues. So my chiefs are standing up. What you know, we would honor these treaties were made, and can the government just come in, any government, and say, hey, no more. In 1997, we had a 1990 land claim agreement on Manitoulin Island. And when the Progressive Conservatives came into power, 7 years after we wrote a 25-year agreement, he ripped that up in front of us. He ripped the agreement up to our benefit then, because what we signed and promised in 1990, it was fulfilled, but only for him to rip it up in 1997. We weren't going to return anything back. But treaties are supposed to be sacred, or why make them? Treaties, and these are our lands. And I said outside here, I think I hope 53 does not go through. And if it does, I said, hey, maybe we can use this building for collateral to pay our legal bills, because this is on our lands. We got to step up. We got to start saying this now, because we live in reserves. We're leftover territories. That's where we are, in small swamps. We're not growing, but everybody else is. Everybody's going into our mining. The Volkswagen plant, the battery plant is going to go for Ontario. They need the mining resources. They need some minerals from there. And my chiefs are already putting up their flags, no trespassing. Work with us. Work with my chiefs. If they want to work, come with me. Let's do it. We'll set it up, and let's see what we can do. But right now, we are not laying back quietly on Bill 53, because it's got second reading now.
I think the feds are hearing you, because as far as I can tell, they remain committed.
Oh, we're not going to go away. We're not going to go away. We're not going to. If they want to keep pushing through, you're going to see more of this. You know, I've been off the highway now for in the middle of the highway for about 6-7 years now. We're back. We're coming back. Chief.
Brent, you have to also recognize that, we're talking about Parliament here, and there are many parliamentarians wouldn't be sitting there today without the First Nations support in getting elected. I believe there are 35 ridings across Canada in which First Nations hold the balance of power. So these parliamentarians, if they want to support the First Nations in the next federal election, they better start listening to the representations that we have made here today, yesterday, and so forth. They have gotten to their positions by virtue of First Nations supporting them. And I don't care what political party they belong to or what political stripe they carry, that this is based on in our inherent rights. This is based on law. So for them to, if they're going to ignore our concerns, we will make sure that we bring this movement forward. And if it becomes a political issue in the next federal election, that will be done for sure. Miigwech.
I guess I will close with one to all of us here, and that the government and different peoples have taken my leadership to court many times, and majority, if not all of them, courts side with us. So let's do this. Let's not waste resources, because right now this government and the provincial government they're being screamed at for housing, when we can put money into housing then instead of dragging us to the courts on something that is real to us, that I truly believe the court will side with us on this. So let's not waste them resources, and we know what we want and what belongs to us, and let's share that. And that's all my chiefs have been saying, to share the resources. Don't take it away from us, because we're not going to sit quietly. We got a future too. We have kids just like everybody else in this building, in this province does. So again, coast to coast, we were here today, different leaders, and our regional chief, Cindy Woodhouse, is meeting with the Prime Minister tonight in New York. We are going to convey these messages that is happening here today. She is on our behalf over there. So we're all over. We're not stuck at home saying, geez, I wish I can be over there. We're all over. Miigwech.
Any more questions? No more questions? Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sigurd Swagweg, Gala Hindi Neo Gets Wagishli Wagini Wakitaloda, Oni Dag, Ngwe, Wanege, Ani Bojo, Tansei, Kinapi, How, Yanko, Yukodongos. So, part of why I wanted to share this stream today was that I saw that press conference, and I just felt like there are so many people that are on both sides of that argument. And for me, I have friends um, who have indigenous ancestry, but are not recognized as indigenous by the definition of the Indian Act, because it was their grandmother, or it was a um, done in a time period that doesn't fit with the systemic restrictions that we're uh, kind of stuck in dealing with now. And I have friends who call themselves Métis who actually do live in a spiritual indigenous way, whose ancestry to the indigenous culture is back 2 or 3 generations, or sometimes in some cases even 4 generations, that but that are a part of a community that uh, they have learned, and are continuing to learn, um, the ways of indigenous culture, and yet and they are fighting for this, and for their sake. I mean, I can understand why. Um, the problem in Ontario right now is that there are groups of people, as we saw in some of those clips, that historically have never been part of this area, and you don't just pop up and say we are now part of. We live in this area. We have for the last three generations, so we are Métis. It doesn't just happen like that. Either you are or you're not. And the definition of Métis, I think, because it's such a broad term, creates more conflict. And that's maybe part of the goal of the colonial mindset is that the whole divide and conquer mentality of let's throw another term in there that will not only confuse but divide people, and ultimately that's essentially what's happened at this point is that we have uh, Indigenous First Nations people here in Ontario that are saying, wait, where's this coming from, and why do we all of a sudden have a whole entire new group that historically has never been part of our area coming up and saying that they are now part of it, and wanting to access the same um, treaty rights, like Bill C-35 has put up there, and and we should just be okay with it because we have fought so hard for some of the funding and rights that we have now that to add to that, uh, ultimately that burden is meaning we would have to fight harder to continue to expand on those benefits to include new groups of people into that picture. And truth be told, the government should be doing that. And it should, just like uh, the whole thing about the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. That's not something that we should be raising money for. That's not something that we should have to fund. That should be the government paying for the mistakes that it has made in the past to reconcile, as they claim that they've been is a priority for this government, is to get to truth and reconciliation. Well, I think that we're done with the lip service. We need to actually see the action now. Stop telling us what you want, what you think we want to hear, and start doing what we need. And that's what ultimately we should be getting to. Um, so when I saw this press conference, I thought, this has been an argument that has gone on for a while. Like Lasu said, he quoted 30 years. I don't know what the time frame is, to be quite honest, as to how long we've been really battling this. But um, indigenous people have been battling the colonial government for 500 years. So, so this is not, this might be new in the grand scheme of things, but it's not new in the fight of indigenous peoples trying to get some sort of um, treatment of being like we're humans. Stop treating us like we're not human. We didn't get the right to go to college until 1951, and then in 1951, when we got the right to go to college, it was only on the basis that if we became a clergyman or or a professor or anything like that, we lost our status. How is that right? That is just it just baffles my mind that you can exchange education for your identity. That it, nowhere does that make any sense um, to me in any case. So I hope that some of that was at least giving you a little bit of something to think about. And Sugoli, Dory, Yelko for popping in. I appreciate that. We've been actually going for a little while, and this was just basically it was a it was just a spur of the moment. I want to share some shit kind of stream, and so this is what we've done. And so 1951, we first got our rights to actually getting education. 1960 was the first time we actually got the right to vote. Women got the right to vote before indigenous people got to vote. Not that I'm saying anything about women having the right. I mean every human should have the right to vote from the time that this system was set up. Whether you're a woman, whether you're indigenous, whether you're black, it you should have the right to vote. I mean uh, that just seems to be a human right as being on this turtle island. So that's that's just in my opinion. Someone might argue that, but it be that be that it will. I wanted to share these clips in any case. So I have. It is now like 9:30 in the morning. Um, I should have gone to bed a long time ago. So I'm gonna raid out. I hope that you all stick around at least for the raid and share some love with another streamer. This is not my normal time to stream, to be quite honest. I just couldn't not share this stuff when it was on my mind. And I want to say a big yell go to Bago Rabbit and Claire Burr, both of you for raiding in and bringing your communities here. I want to say a big yell go to Ruskinator and Boobersari for the donos to the IRSSSS and Chrysanthemum resub now for 9 months. ZX resub now for 3 months, and Dougie Fresh gifting 1,000 bits. And I appreciate all of that support. Thank you, all of you, so much for that. And so I'm going to, as I always do, I play a rendition of The Peaceful Warrior as a way of ending the stream so that you can hear something that someone's added, someone's take on my poem. So let me get that started. In the meantime, while that's playing, I will post I'll post this VOD up too. So if you missed any of the videos that we shared today, I will post a VOD up within probably 10 minutes of the stream so that you can access it to watch, rewatch, or even to share if you are so inclined to share the VODs. That would be appreciated too. So don't be shy about doing that if you feel it's worth sharing. In the meantime, let me get a rendition of the Peaceful Warrior up here that I can share, and I'm gonna do a rendition. I mentioned earlier in the stream I'm gonna be a guest on Towards Night stream on September 28th, 8 p.m. So next week is a busy week. We've got documentaries, we've got some film, and we've got a lunchtime panel discussions going on. So check the schedule, see if there's any of those subjects that you are interested in hearing, and, uh, and please feel free to join us for any of those that you're interested in. And then the one thing that's not on the schedule is my visit or my guest appearance on Towards Night because it's on his channel. And we're going to talk about some of the goals of what everything Indigenous is trying to accomplish. I will share a teaching on there. I will share a poem which you may or may not have heard previously. So it should be fun and interesting to be on. It'll be the first time I'm on someone else's stream. October 14th, I'm going to be will be the first time I'm on I'll be on a raid train, partaking in a raid train that was organized by Aza Inspirator. So that should be interesting. It'll be kind of, I think, a DJ uh, type raid train. And then, was there anything else? There was. So I'm sure I'm probably missing something, but keep an eye on the channel in any case, or join the Discord and do that. So I'm going to share Towards Night's rendition of the Peaceful Warrior because he did this on the fly. So he did not have any practice. I went into his stream one night and I said, "Hey, here's some words. Can you do something with it?" And he took it and went with it. And I think that that was really cool. So again, for those of you who didn't catch the dates, um, November 28th, September 28th, 8 p.m. I'll be on Towards the Night stream. October 14th, I will be doing the raid train. The week of September 25th to the 28th, we're going to be doing a lot of kind of short streams. Um, the Monday, for example, we're doing a virtual tour of the Mohawk Institute, which was the first Indian residential school built in Canada in 1831. Probably the longest, one of the longest running residential schools. It's now a museum, been converted to a museum, but we're going to see a virtual tour of that. And then the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation is doing. We are doing 1 hour lunch chats. So Monday will be the history of residential schools. Tuesday will be intergenerational effects of residential schools. Wednesday. I think it's uh, oh, my brain has lost me for a sec. Thursday I know is the UNDRIP, so the United Nations of Declaration of Indigenous Rights, or Rights to Indigenous Peoples, will be discussed on Thursday. You check the calendar anyway. It'll all be up there, and I'll update that as we go. And I'm sure that I'm going to end up adding stuff to that as well as we go along here, and as I find more things that we're going to be able to share. So, again, I'm going to take my mug off the screen here. I'm going to get Towards Night rendition of the Peaceful Warrior. He did this again, like I said, on the fly. He didn't have any, he didn't get a chance to read through the lyrics really prior to when I sent it to him and said, "Hey, can you do this?" And he said, "Well, let me look at it." And he said, "Okay, I'm doing it." And he just did it. So I don't know that he expected it to be as long as he did because, like Num the Geek said when he did it, he says, "Wow, there's a lot of words here." So, and there are a lot of words to it, so I get that. But I think that he did a really awesome job of it when he did it, and so I hope that you'll listen to that. While I'm playing that, I'll put in the raid calls, copy a raid call, and then come join us, even if it's just to say hi to whoever the next streamer is. So let me get again my mug off the screen here, and we'll get Towards the Night transition going, and then we'll move on from there. And thank you so much for all of your support and just for being here. I appreciate it.
One time, it's Towards Night. Yo, from Astoria streets, My name is Towards Night, yo, I'm raw on the beats, yo, sometimes I'm at war for that peace. All senseless attacks I see must cease. Yeah, I've seen too many of the deceased, so what am I doing here? What do I really want to say? I go into my brain and I just let it go away. Is that this world that has got to fucking change its ways? Cause it feels like a winding maze. See, I'm gonna fight for the red, white, yellow, and black. Can't back up tonight, no, we gotta go forward. The name is fucking Towards. It's that love that I'm gonna show you. Yo, I'm gonna fight for the ones who cannot fight back. I'm gonna talk to the creatures when I do that on tracks, from the water to the sky. Yo, there's no limits. I'm talking about the issues that we're gonna sign. Yo, I'm grinning right now cause I see the truth is what we bring to the slides, not lying down again. I'm standing up for people that cannot get that power. Yeah, while they're still alive, I'm giving them the flowers. Yo, I'm talking about all the issues from truth to the lies. Yeah, my whole world is this booth. I'm gonna make my stand with a paper and a pen, but me, I'm doing this right from my head. I just need one light. Yo, all I need is one light. Yo, that's all I need. Yo, it's Towards Night, the MC from Astoria. I cause war in my heart, but peaceful warrior is what I am. I flip it and now it's raw. Yo, my gun's not drawn. It's my mic that I'm using to bring some of that love. I'm talking about that, yo, and we're not even done. There's more to fight. Yo, I can't want to argue, go back to bed again. No, I wanna go far, dude. You're never gonna win against what I stand for. Cause what I wanna do is just slam raw. Sit down here, shut up and listen as I give my grand tour. Yo, pure is what I wanna be again. I'm gonna target the corruption in the government, cause I see, not hushing, I'm discovering all the fucking poison that they're bringing to the land. The environment's not the same, I'm taking a stand. Gotta take the target to the injustices, to this people, different steeples, what I'm bringing again. Gonna hit every target or I won't keep still. Yo, I need another fucking mic, it's my quill that I'm using. I'm gonna battle the battle of all the battles. Yo, I got the cages done cause I rattle them. Yo, shaking up the cage now, cattle is not what I am. Yo, I'm taking another gamble. Yo, that my mic is what I'm using. Yeah, I'm gonna have to fucking get this fuse, it's just lit. Yo, instead of using war, no, I'm gonna flip a fucking rhyme that's so raw. Yeah, you're never gonna get rid of me, I'm here forever. Even when I die, I know my lyrics they will remember. Not until the problems of the world are cut at the knee. Yo, because it's love that the world just needs. Know what I'm saying? Let me kick this out just one more time. It's crystal clear, we're not getting no more fear in my mind. Yo, the message in my rhyme, it's getting in your minds. Never in vain, yo, it's embedded in their spines. My name is Towards Night, I'm at war for peace, never pain, it's eventually gonna be something. Yo, Lenin, yeah, he was just stumping the whole world. King and Gandhi are all like symbolic crosses. Yo, I'm gonna toss is getting brolic. Speakers of the past are gonna inspire the speakers of the future. That's what's gonna happen. You're the seeker is what I am. We're gonna try to heal this fucking world with metaphorical sutures. Yeah, unfurled. Metaphorical is what I meant. Sorry, I tripped up, but hopefully I'm gonna get you all to listen. My name is Towards Night and I'm at war for peace. Yo, raw on beats. Yo, I'm exploring these heat moments right now. So senseless attacks, they must cease. Yes, I'm gonna sentence the fact to all the people with my tracks. Yo, I won't be able to move this world all alone, so I need the whole crew. So lie together, die together, but I know that together we will rhyme forever. So just remember, this is also your home. As long as we stand, we're not alone. So if I put my voice with your